listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
It's going to be the St. Valentine's Day massacre on here this evening. I'll be massacring Keir Starmer, the block of wood that poses as the leader of Her Majesty's opposition. We'll be massacring Joe Biden, the octogenarian fool who is leading us all over the cliff into war in Eastern Europe. We'll be praying that there's no massacre in the Ukraine, but the sharpest of advance guards of the Ukrainian armed forces have just advanced and are in combat residence with their leader on call on the border with the Eastern Ukrainian autonomous territories in Donetsk. The signs don't look good. It looks like the balloon is about to go up. Russia will not invade Ukraine, but Ukraine looks about to invade the Russian, ethnically Russian-speaking, oftentimes Russian citizens who live in the east of their own country. If it was in Iraq, we'd be saying they're going to make war on their own people. We'll be talking about the whole political scene from east to west, from north to south, in the course of the next 3 hours. So fasten your seatbelts. This is rock and roll radio with pictures. It's the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik. We speak your language.
The mother of all talk shows. The only education you can get for free. George Galloway.
This is Radio Sputnik.
I want to talk about this block of wood first, just to get him out of the way, because in many respects he's the least important person that we'll be talking about on tonight's show. But he's important to me. Keir Starmer, he was barracked, even rudely, although not a finger was laid upon him, in a barney in Whitehall this week, a barney that he deliberately chose to walk through, a barney of about 40 people. Their presence there was not a secret. You didn't need bloodhounds to tell that they were there, if you know what I mean. He could have walked along the embankment just outside my window, in through the doors of Portcullis House, where I sat for many years myself, and walked through an entirely private walkway into the Parliament building. But he didn't. He came out of the Ministry of Defence building and walked, rather than was driven in the officially provided state security, bulletproof, bomb-proof, even insult-proof automobile that the country provides for him. He decided to walk through a rough house of people led by someone called Piers Corbyn, brother of Jeremy Corbyn, about whom more in a minute. They shouted things at him, poor lamb. They shouted things like, "Why did you prosecute Julian Assange?" They shouted things like, "Why are you betraying the working class?" All kinds of mean things like that. The things that they shouted were all, as it happens, entirely truthful. Doesn't always happen that way, but on this occasion they were entirely truthful. The entire British broadcast media machine went into overdrive to blame the Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, for this roughhouse in which no one had a finger laid upon them. The problem is, they said, someone shouted, who knows who, "Why didn't you prosecute Jimmy Savile?" This is now described by the state broadcaster BBC as a false claim. But it is not a false claim. Just like the fact that Keir Starmer assisted, in fact, persisted in assisting the fake prosecution of Julian Assange. You'll remember that Boris Johnson said to Keir Starmer, "You spent more time prosecuting journalists and not prosecuting Jimmy Savile, the notorious paedophile who sexually assaulted, raped, and abused literally hundreds of people, all the while being a star of the British Broadcasting Corporation." The BBC now says on every news bulletin that Boris Johnson's claim is a false claim. But it is not a false claim. First of all, Keir Starmer undoubtedly spent a lot of his time prosecuting journalists. And secondly, Jimmy Savile was never prosecuted, although Keir Starmer was the director of public prosecutions. Now, he says he was not in charge of the file on whether or not Savile should be prosecuted. But he was the head of the department, and the file was with one of his underlings. His underling was deciding whether to prosecute a knight of the realm, Sir Jimmy Savile, a friend of the royal family, particularly close with Prince Charles, the heir to the throne. He was considering whether to prosecute one of the best known men in the land, a fixture of the BBC for many decades. So if Keir Starmer was not involved in the decision not to prosecute Jimmy Savile, why not? Who but the Director of Public Prosecutions should have been overseeing a decision of that magnitude with all of its potential to embarrass the royal family, to shame the BBC, and to shock the entire country and its population? If he didn't get involved, why didn't he get involved? So actually, Johnson's jibe was entirely truthful, and incitement by telling the truth didn't used to be an offence. Although it is now, as many of us are finding, telling the truth can be a dangerous practice, as you may find in weeks to come, even here on the mother of all talk shows, which is why I say to you now, if you have not done so, you must follow me on my Telegram channel, because it is perfectly possible, depending on what happens after St. Valentine's Day, that that's the only place you'll be able to find me. So please download Telegram and follow my Telegram channel. If you want to keep hearing from me, of course. If you want to hear me speak what I believe to be the truth. I might be wrong, I might be right, I might be somewhere in between, but you can be sure that whatever I'm saying to you, I'm saying because I believe it. It is a channel that is our last resort. So please, we'll give you the address later on the screen, I think. Is it somewhere? T.me/George Galloway. Please do it in the course of this show. Why am I sounding alarmed? Well, I'm alarmed on your behalf. It won't actually silence me. But there is every possibility that war is about to break out in the Ukraine with Sir Keir Starmer's full backing. It's a strange kind of opposition we have in the British Parliament. You support everything that the government does. Only later do you, in hindsight, make criticisms. But there might not be any hindsight if the balloon goes up in the Ukraine. Now, I have said to you repeatedly, and I say it to you again now, Russia will not invade Ukraine, but Ukraine may very well invade the millions of ethnically Russian people who live in the eastern part of their country, who were granted, according to the Minsk Agreement, autonomous status. An agreement signed by France and Germany, signed by the Ukrainian government itself, that would recognize these people as autonomous of the coup regime with its fascist base in the Azov battalion and the street forces around the Hitler ally Bandera, would grant them autonomous status. This is important. It's not a piece of semantics on my part. These people were promised, guaranteed in fact, in the Minsk Agreement, autonomous status. If, as may be happening even as I speak, the Ukrainian armed forces, armed by Britain, the United States, and other NATO allies, pumped full, like a turkey, pumped full, stuffed with NATO weaponry, launches an attack tonight or tomorrow, or Tuesday or Wednesday, as the Americans have predicted, war will break out, then indeed there will be war, because Russia cannot, how could it, stand by and allow millions of ethnic Russians, hundreds of thousands of them Russian citizens, to be massacred by NATO weapons in the hands of fascist and extreme nationalist forces in the Ukrainian armed forces. Of course, it could not. And so if such a massacre were to begin, then I have no doubt at all that the Russian armed forces would have to come to the defense of their compatriots, of their fellow citizens in some cases, and of their own blood. That will be billed as a Russian invasion of Ukraine, but it will not be. It will be a defense of Russian people being invaded by a government that has already granted those people autonomous status within Ukraine. These are important distinctions that you must learn now before it is too late. If that happens, then we're promised the mother of all sanctions regimes against Russia. That will have many consequences. The first of those will be there'll be no more Russian gas in Europe. Don't worry, Joe Biden has already got tankers on the ocean, bringing you much more expensive American LPG that will not fill even a tiny percentage of the gas supply that will be lost from Russia. That gas powers 50% of German energy requirements and about 25% of all European gas requirements. In Britain, it's low, about 5%. But that 5% will be missed and will cause still further rises in the price of energy. In Europe, the factories will halt. The wheels will stop turning. There will be millions of people unemployed, but don't worry. If there is a war in the Ukraine, there will be millions, maybe 5 millions, maybe 10 millions of Ukrainian refugees flooding west into Europe. They just haven't told you that yet. But you can take it from me that the refugee flow from a war in Ukraine will make all previous refugee crises in Europe seem like a vicar's tea party. So get ready. Never mind arriving on dinghies in the beaches of southern England, never mind that. Coming in their hundreds, I'm talking millions of refugees will be arriving by land, coming your way soon. There will be many other consequences, one of which almost certainly will be the closure by the British state of RT, in which case you'll have to find me on other platforms, unless those other platforms also begin to shut down. This, of course, will be answered by Russia. There will be no British broadcaster or journalist plying their trade in Russia, period, full stop. There will be no ambassadors in London or in Moscow. There will be no journalists in Moscow if there is no broadcasting by RT and Sputnik here in Britain. You see where I'm going with this? This is about to go down the rabbit hole. Now, it may be that the negotiations, which one must presume are going on behind the scenes, will somehow pull a rabbit out of the hat. But it's late for that now. The US government has said, although they didn't tell the Ukrainian government, that the war begins on Wednesday, in which case you can look out for me on my Wednesday night broadcast to react to it, if I'm allowed to make it, of course, because all in the name of freedom and liberty this is being done. So we may be about to enter a period that we have actually never seen. Even at the height of the Cold War, there were ambassadors in place. There were journalists working in each other's country. There was trade between the Eastern Bloc and the West. Now, you may be asking yourself, what's this all about? Which is a good question that they are asking in Moscow also. There is no doubt that the psyops, the psychological warfare that has been mounted now for months, is an indication that NATO intends to have a war. But a war for what? All they had to say was that Ukraine, because it has a territorial dispute pre-existing with its neighbor, Russia, cannot join NATO. And that therefore no NATO armies and weapons, including nuclear weapons, will be sighted in Ukraine, at least until Ukraine no longer has a territorial dispute with its neighbor and can join NATO. That's all they had to say, but they would not say it. Now, personally, I think this is a kind of madness. I have said to you many times, I understand the conflict between the West, NATO, and China. China has an ideological system which is an existential threat to Western capitalism and American hegemony. It's obvious why you would have such a standoff with China. But Russia is a white, European, Christian, capitalist country. Why do you need to have Russia as your enemy? I'll tell you why. Because Russia has a leadership that will not allow their country to be ordered around in the way that the German government is absolutely unembarrassed. Joe Biden said in the presence of the German Prime Minister that the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline in Germany will not be allowed to operate. How's that? How's that for a definition of an occupied country? Occupied, yes, by 30,000 American troops, but more importantly, Germany's mind is occupied by the United States hegemon. The only European country that is sufficiently important and powerful enough to have any impact on this situation is France. And to be fair to little Macron, he's doing what he can to avert disaster. But it's quite clear that Germany and most of the other European countries, preeminently my own, of Great Britain, are no more than vassal states of the American empire. And it's going to cost them plenty, not just in gas prices. Because when the conflict moves, as it will, back to China, you will find that the same iron curtain has been brought down between Western countries and China, as is about to be brought down between Western countries and Russia. No more Chinese imports, no more Russian gas, no more glad, confident morning. You know, it's only 6 years since George Osborne and David Cameron announced the beginning of a new golden age between Britain and China. The gold has turned to ash, and we're going to discuss it at length this evening on the mother of all talk shows.
Radio Sputnik.
You know, and it's a very, thank you for, you know, I'm a big fan of your show, Gigi. Great debate, great. And I'm Scottish. I'm very passionate about what's happening there, you know. I had a great mom. She was Scottish, Mary McLeod. She taught me well. She taught me well at everything, including golf. I love Scotland, and I love the Scottish food. It's great food. I said to Melania, you know, haggis, look at that. What's more Scottish than that? Me. I am that haggis. She said, what, thin-skinned and full of crap?
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
I'm sure you're going to want to have your say this evening. Here are the telephone numbers. And remember, it's entirely free to call the show. If you're in the United Kingdom, it's 08081 965522. That's 08081 965522. If you're in the United States or in Canada under siege, it's also free to call the show. It's +1 844 944 3344. That's +1 844 944 3344. Without further ado, let's cross to one of the smartest young men in the United States. He's Jackson Hinkle, US-based political analyst and host of the increasingly popular podcast, The Dive. Let's hear from Jackson. Welcome on board the mother of all talk shows, Jackson. It's getting late to avoid the war. What's your take on it?
Well, I mean, I think that just about everyone in the world wants to avoid this war, you know, and especially Russia and Ukraine. It seems like the only people who really want a war are the same people who've been lying us into wars for decades and decades now, the United States and the United Kingdom. And, you know, Vladimir Putin is doing everything within his power to try and prevent this war. He made a plea directly to British press this past week saying, I do not want this. All I'm asking for is the United States to uphold previous commitments that they have made to our country. So there's not a whole lot more that they can do. And the U.S. is going to do what they've always done, manipulate foreign powers that they have already launched coups and regime change operations in, like they did in Ukraine in 2014, to try and achieve their greater foreign policy goals of destabilizing countries that don't toe a U.S., hegemonic line on a global stage.
It's perfectly expressed, perfectly summed up, but it begs the question, why? Two whys. Why are European countries preparing to fight an American war that America is not going to fight? The American troops have now all been withdrawn from Ukraine. So have the British troops, by the way. But it is the continent of Europe that will pay in blood and economic ruin if this war happens in the next 72 hours, as the US has promised us it will. So that's the first why. The second why is the one I posed earlier. Why does the United States have to have Russia as an enemy?
Those are really good questions. As for the first one, I don't think that there's any real good answer for that other than Ukrainians were stripped of their voices in 2014 when the U.S. led a coup in the country. They don't have a voice as to how their government operates anymore. They don't have a voice as to what their government is going to be going to war over, unfortunately. Their government is more inclined, unfortunately, I think, to listen to United States, deep state officials. That being said, we've also seen Zelensky come out and say that he doesn't want a war and he doesn't believe that Russia is going to invade Ukraine. We've seen their defense minister, Ukraine's defense minister, over the past 2 weeks say that Ukrainians should not be packing their bags. They should not be worried. This is all part of the United States' larger game of diplomatic chess. So Ukrainians, I believe, do not want a war. Unfortunately, again, as we've seen the United States do and the United Kingdom do in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Syria, and what they're trying to do, I think, in China right now, lying about Hong Kong, Tibet, and Uyghurs, they are trying to destabilize foreign countries that don't toe their line on the U.S. global stage. Speaking as to, the likelihood of this happening, we're getting conflicting messages even out of the White House. We see some messages coming out and saying that, well, a Russian invasion is imminent, it's days away, and it's going to happen this week. And then we're seeing other messages come out of the White House almost simultaneously saying, well, Vladimir Putin, he might not be so sure. He may not have made a final decision as to whether or not he's going to invade Ukraine. All the while, Vladimir Putin is still reiterating that he does not want to do this. It's a question of whether or not the U.S. is going to break their agreements that they have previously made, going all the way back to 1990, and that have been, reiterated and re-agreed upon by U.S. and U.K. leaders and other, Western aligned leaders to the Russians for up until today, and it's very, very disappointing to see this, because I truly believe that the global population, though they do not want a war, they also might not understand just how big of a deal this is and how scary the future could be with these two nuclear powers going to war. Russia is the most powerful military that the U.S. would be fighting against out of any military in the past 50 years combined. The United States just got their butts handed to them in Afghanistan when they tried to maintain special ops and black ops and private contractors in Afghanistan, and the Taliban kicked them out. So I don't see this going well. The United States military is very apt and strong, but it's led by a bunch of individuals who want to saber rattle and go to war, even if it means countless individuals dying and the world going into a very dark place.
How's it playing in Peoria? What's the U.S. public's attitude to it, or are they oblivious to it?
The U.S. public is aware of what's happening, but they don't understand the history of what has taken place between the U.S., Ukraine, and Russia. Right? The U.S. doesn't understand, again, as I just mentioned, that they have made promises going back all the way to 1990 that they would not extend NATO or NATO troops or NATO weaponry 1 inch east of Germany, right? Which is a very important point to bring up in this broader discussion. You hear a lot of people, even self-described socialists and self-described Marxists, who are going out on their broadcasts, their podcasts, their shows right now and saying that, well, Russia needs to come to a formal agreement with the United States, and that might involve making concessions. Again, this is not about Russia asking or the United States asking for concessions. This is about the United States trying to impose their will on other countries and break promises that they've made for decades going back now. So I think the fundamental problem here is that a lot of people in the United States sure don't want a war, but they also don't understand that the U.S. again is lying us into another potentially very deadly and costly war that could amount to World War III.
Is there any opposition to it, Jackson?
I'm a living embodiment of opposition to this. We have plenty of anti-imperialists, both on the right and the left in the United States. I myself am on the left, but Tucker Carlson, who has the #1 news show in the nation for cable news, he averages 3.24 million viewers every episode of his show per night. He has been a very, very vocal critic of the deep state's plans in the United States to go to war against Russia by allying us into this this battle over Ukraine. So fortunately, there have been some voices of reason, both on the left and the right, even in mainstream circles on this matter. But as for the rest of the mainstream news, you look at broadcasts like CBS, MSNBC, CNN, NBC, they are all directly falling in line with the imperialists, the neocons, and the Democratic establishment like Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer, who would love to see nothing more than going to war with Russia. Because what that means is, A, destabilization of Russia. And in a moment where we are truly moving into an age of multipolarity, the ending of unipolar American rule on the global stage, but also, as with every war, you're going to have a lot of increased profits for shareholders of arms industry companies like Raytheon and Boeing and all the others.
Well, what about the Trumpers? Now, I said the other night, it's a controversial point, but it's genuinely my view, that if Trump was the president, there would have been a deal cut by now with something in it for everybody. I believe that. I don't know if you do, but in any case, what is Trump and his support base saying about this?
It's very possible. I don't think it's that outrageous of a statement for you to have made. Donald Trump, he notably campaigned as being an anti-interventionist, especially with regard to certain countries. Notably, when he got into office, that all kind of changed. His hand was forced into appointing notorious deep state officials like John Bolton into his administration, James Jeffries into his administration to oversee Syria. Who knows what could have happened? It's very possible that there could have been some sort of a diplomatic talks that would have ended this crisis long before what we're seeing right now with Joe Biden. Unfortunately, that's just not the case, and we don't know. What we do know is that we have Joe Biden in office, a man who has been probably the most notorious warmonger for the past 40 years of his political career that has been entirely funded and propped up by corporate America. And he wants nothing more than to try and destabilize a foreign adversary in his eyes, like Russia. But getting back to that question you asked me a minute ago, why can't the United States be working with Russia in a mutually beneficial way? That's a great question. It's a question that's been posed for years in American politics. Henry Carey, who was Abraham Lincoln's economic advisor, wanted nothing more than this. He wanted to industrialize the world with leading global powers like Germany, for example. I think that right now, we're seeing Russia and China work together to try and industrialize the world, and they're reaping the benefits of that. America, on the other hand, can't provide food, clothing, clean drinking water, electricity, stable housing, or healthcare to our population because we have 800 plus military bases in 80 different countries, and we're waging who knows how many wars.
That's the law of unintended consequence, isn't it? That by picking a fight with both Russia and China at the same time, they have pushed Russia and China together ineluctably to the point that they're more or less one bloc now. And for someone my age, that's quite a surprising thing.
Yeah, it's really incredible. And you're seeing not only Russia and China unite, act more, I'd say, as partners rather than close allies, but they are uniting. You're also seeing these two countries in this age of multipolarity that we are being ushered into work with a bunch of other smaller countries all across the globe who have made a formal alliance called a Group of Friends in defense of the UN Charter, right? And they are working together to circumvent U.S. sanctions, to try and work around U.S. hybrid warfare, like regime change operations, meddling in the media of sovereign nations. And it's working, right? That's why the United States is, as so many see it to be, a crumbling empire, because they no longer are able to have their control over every single corner of this globe. It's showing that Russia and China, notably even after the 2014 coup in Ukraine, when Crimea was, after their referendum, was officially annexed into Russia, they have a substantial amount of control that they're able to exhibit on the global stage in a balance to the United States. So the United States right now, as I see it, is freaking out. They don't know what to do. They see that their empire is crumbling. They understand that the citizenry, both left and right, are opposed to them. There's a political realignment happening in this country. Even the majority of Republicans of this Trump MAGA base that you mentioned are opposed to going to war with Russia. It's an incredible thing. It's a beautiful thing as an American to see this. Unfortunately, our politicians don't listen to us. Our politicians listen to corporate America, to deep state officials, and that's how it's going to be for the foreseeable future.
I told you this guy was good, didn't I? Jackson, how do we see your work? How do people follow you on The Dive?
I appreciate the kind words, and thank you for having me on. You can find me on YouTube at The Dive with Jackson Hinkle.
I'll be doing that, and I encourage everyone else to do so. Jackson Hinkle, thanks for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Will there be war over Ukraine? 2,000 people have voted already. On Twitter, 25% say yes and 75% say no. On YouTube, 23% say yes, 77% say no. On Telegram, 21% say yes and 79% say no. Get voting on those platforms, won't you? On this day in 1942, Hitler abandoned his plan to invade Britain. What was the plan called? A, Albatross, B, Sea Lion, C, Doberman. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
We are above all the latest developments, and we don't take any sides. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
Want to know how international issues fit into local ones and how local issues fit into international ones? With the historical context to tie them together, we're bringing it to you all by any means necessary. Tune in weekdays from 2 to 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time to hear me, Jackie Lukeman, alongside my co-host, Sean Blackman. By any means necessary, your guide to connecting the social, political, and economic movements shaping the world around us.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik.
Mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
On this day in 1942, it's 1940. Who writes this stuff? On this day in 1940, Hitler abandoned his plan to invade Britain. The plan was called Operation Sea Lion. Now, in my debut novel, Queensway, we suppose counterfactually that actually Hitler did invade Britain. He did get across the channel. Its sequel called Black Lake will be out very, very soon. If my wife is listening, you better get that in the post to people as quickly as possible. And in those two novels, we presuppose that the Battle of Britain went the other way. And then the question was, who would be the resistance? Who would be the collaborators? Will there be war over Ukraine? You can vote on that on my Twitter feed, on my YouTube, and on my Telegram. Gideon Levy is the greatest man in Israel. Of that, I have no doubt, and most of our viewers already know it. He had to confront the fact that last week, Amnesty International declared his country to be an apartheid state. It has caused enormous convulsions, and a big effort is being made to discredit Amnesty International as a result. But Gideon Levy of Haaretz newspaper, the most respected and respectable newspaper in Israel, Gideon Levy wrote just exactly in what regard is the Amnesty International report wrong. So we thought we should have him again on the show to ask and maybe answer that very question. Gideon Levy joins me now from Israel. Gideon, welcome back to the show. Before we go on to the Amnesty International issue, I'd like to ask you another question in relation to Ukraine. It is a matter of historical fact that the Nazis massacred a gigantic number, many hundreds of thousands of Ukrainian Jews, and that they did so with local allies. Those local allies were grouped around a man called Stepan Bandera, whose forces fell upon the Ukrainian Jews even before the SS got there. They massacred their own Jews, as indeed happened in other parts of Europe. The followers of Bandera actually have a regiment in the Ukrainian army, the Azov Battalion. Their street power is to be seen. Their swastikas, their Bandera pictures, their SS insignia on their helmets and so on. How did it come to be, do you think, that Western countries are now arming people who were complicit, indeed were ahead of the game in the Holocaust in Ukraine in the early part of the Second World War?
It's very hard to tell because there is, I guess, a new Ukraine also, like there is a new Germany, like there is a new Russia. And I think that in Israel we don't talk about it. We talk only right now about the real effort to prevent a war. This should be the main thing now, to do anything possible to prevent a war, because a war will not serve anybody.
Are you optimistic about that or pessimistic?
Very hard to tell. Tell me, what do you think?
Well, I thought a very telling decision, the most telling of all the decisions that I heard in the last few days, was the decision by Israel to withdraw its citizens from Ukraine. I say it because Israel usually knows what's happening or about to happen in the world. Secondly, Israel has, despite everything, a good relationship with Russia. It would not want at an extremely sensitive time to stab Russia in the back. There are close relations between Russian people, many of whom live in Israel. There's visa-free travel between the two countries and so on. Stalin was the first leader in the whole world to recognize Israel. Stalin's allies in Czechoslovakia provided the weapons for the Israeli armed forces during the War of Independence and so on. So when Israel decided to pull its people out of Ukraine, I felt that was a very strong signal that there is going to be a war.
I'm not so sure, because Israel follows the United States, and Israel gets its information from the United States. And the feeling is that the United States wants to spread the feeling that we are on the eve of a war. Is it true or not? Only time will show, but it's not necessarily so. Yeah, it seems so, but I think that Israel here followed the United States, and once the United States gave those signals, Israel reacted almost automatically, and still there is a chance, I want to believe, that this all leads only to a big maneuver, but not to a real war with bloodshed and occupations.
Let's move on then to the Amnesty International report. What was wrong with Amnesty International's conclusions? Anything?
Nothing was wrong, only the delay, because I think that it's already a few years that the world can define and should define Israel as an apartheid state. And I'll tell you where is really the point of no return. As long as the occupation was perceived as something temporary, then you couldn't claim that Israel is an apartheid state, because it has a certain kind of democracy within its sovereign borders and another regime of military occupation in the occupied territories. This did not define Israel as an apartheid state. But once it became clear that the occupation is there to stay, that there are no signs whatsoever that Israel has any kind of intention to put an end to the occupation in any condition, once you realize that over 50 years of occupation are enough of a time, twice more than Israel existed without the occupation, to realize that the occupation is part and parcel of Israel. And once it is part and parcel of Israel, it defines its nature, it defines its regime, it defines its democracy. And Israel cannot be declared anymore as a democracy. This happened in the last years. Amnesty is not the first organization, by the way, to observe this. I'm happy it happened, but now it's about governments and states to realize that this is the reality. You can't break away of it.
It's very damning, isn't it? I mean, I'm so old that in my lifetime, Jews in Britain who may well have supported Israel were in the advance guard politically. They were in the advance guard of the socialist movements, progressive movements, trade union movements. In fact, when I was young, many Jewish people were amongst the supreme activists for the right causes in Britain, and I think that that was true in America and elsewhere.
South Africa. Don't forget South Africa.
And I never, ever will, because I traveled in apartheid South Africa under the protection of the finest people I've ever met, the Jewish members of the African National Congress. And so in those circumstances, for an organization like Amnesty International, with its reach, with its moral authority to make such a judgment, it is terribly damning. How has it impacted on Israeli public opinion?
As usual, by denial, by ignoring, with the great help of most of the Israeli media, who almost ignored this report or ridiculized it or just put it in a very, very small place as if it's nothing. But, you know, it's another step. It's not a game changer. The world will not change, and Israel will not change after this report. But it's another step towards maybe another wake-up call towards the world, toward those who care even about Israel and above all about freedom and equality in the world, that we are facing a second apartheid state now in the Middle East, and the world should deal with it exactly as it dealt with the first apartheid state.
Now, it's easy for me to say here in London, very, very much more difficult for you to say in your journalist chair in Israel, but you did say it because that's the kind of man that you are. What was the response to your answer?
It was not so dramatic because I claim so now for quite a long time. Even my newspaper, which is not exactly with me, claims that Israel is having an apartheid regime in the occupied territories. The only step that I went farther than the newspaper, that I think that you cannot be half a democracy, and if you have an apartheid system in part of the territory, it defines the whole territory, and therefore Israel should be defined as an apartheid state. You know, it's the regular reaction also by the readership of anger or ignoring, above all ignoring. That's the worst enemy, this apathy, this self-content, this confidence that we are the only democracy in the Middle East, that the IDF is the most moral army in the world. This is still very deep-rooted in the Israeli society, and it's very hard to uproot it. We need many, many more forces from the world to start to call the bluff.
It's quite likely to impact in the medium to long term in the United States and in Europe. It's a kind of judgment, condemnation from an unexpected quarter. No one can even begin to mount the charge that Amnesty International is an anti-Semitic organization. As a friend of mine once over dinner, Shulamit Aloni, former Israeli minister, once said, she said it to me, to my face, that we always play this trick, accusing critics of anti-Semitism. Of course, that practice has grown and grown, but there comes a point at which, and I think Amnesty International is that point, at which this becomes self-defeating for supporters of the Israeli system. Don't you think?
Yes, but it didn't reach enough of civil societies in Europe, and still this weapon is paralyzing most of the critics of Israel. And I'm very sorry to say so, this manipulation is very effective, this Israeli manipulation, namely to accuse anyone who dares to criticize Israel or criticize only the occupation as being labeled as an anti-Semite. And I'm really amazed to see how still it is effective, how media in Europe and even social media and civil societies are still so scared of this accusation, and it still paralyzed them and shut their mouths. I mean, it's enough to say anti-Semite and people get paralyzed.
Remarkable. Gideon Levy, you are a remarkable man. Stay safe. Thanks for joining us again on the mother of all talk shows. Let's hope you're right about the war. Will there be war over Ukraine? Well, 2,500 of you have voted, and roughly 3/4 of you think not. Well, let's hope you're right also. Social media coming in. We've got, by the way, the biggest audience we've had for a very long time this evening. Brian Holden says, The real objectives are to make weak leaders in the US and UK look strong, to stop the Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline, and to find an excuse for expansion of NATO further east towards Russia. And Senor says, Tony Blair's NATO bombed my Serbian brothers in Belgrade. No wonder Russia does not want the Tony Blair NATO war criminals on their doorstep. Pat Brannigan says the real countries that get hurt by sanctions are the European countries that used to sell to Russia but now cannot. So they lose that revenue while Russia just creates its own products or buys them from China, Pat. Back Boza says, from what I can see, the personal involvement of Boris Johnson in this crisis has been all that has stopped any war breaking out already. He's the one international statesman with the clout and integrity to act as an honest broker who all can trust. That's signed Ward 5, Broadmoor. Mark says, yes, we are overdue a war. It's been a while. And Marr says the only difference between Democrats and Republicans is the speed at which their knee hits the floor when a corporate donor enters the room. Have I got time for a call? Let me take Elliot in Florida. Go ahead, Elliot.
Oh, George, thank you. How
Welcome.
are you doing?
Well, good.
You know, I wanted to ask or make a comment and get your reaction about Macron's visit to with Putin, his talks with Putin over the Ukraine issue. No, I haven't heard anyone point this out or make this comment. The analysis is, rightly so, that Macron is facing an election and he with a challenge from the right, and that's why he's making these overtures. But it sticks in my mind that there was a what do you call it? The AUKUS submarine deal that was a stab in the back to and there's a phrase, I guess it's Italian. Vengeance is a dish best served cold, and I'm wondering if you think that might be part of the motivation that he might sign an agreement with Putin that they will vote against Ukraine.
Well, I don't think he signed an agreement, and an agreement with France would be worth nothing in any case. It's not France that's going to be fighting the war against Russia. But there's something in what you say, without doubt. You could put that another way, because everything depends which side of the telescope you're looking through. Macron knows better than most just what a treacherous organization NATO is, Perfidion Albion is, and Senile Joe is. So he's not keen to be led into a war by them. I think that Macron is facing an election, and this attempt to avoid war will probably help him in that election. But Joe Biden is facing catastrophic opinion poll results, as is Boris Johnson, who may very well be now living on borrowed time. So every political leader is acting for a multitude of reasons, subject to many factors. What counts is the end result of what it is that they are doing. And the truth is, Macron is attempting to stop war, while the British and the United States leaderships are attempting to create one. Now, coming up in the next hour, we're talking about the truckers in Canada. I'm speaking to James Melville, and the Canadian issue has really taken off since we first raised it here a couple of weeks ago now. A bit of a backlash, too, we got last week. We'll get the trucker side of the story, I'm sure, from James Melville. Keep voting on the poll. A record number of you look likely to do so. Most of you think there's not going to be a war. We'll see about that. Let's get the news first, though, with Jamie Lowe.
Radio Sputnik News.
The president of Ukraine has urged calm, saying that the biggest enemy was panic, as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the imminent threat of Russian military action in Ukraine justifies evacuating the US embassy in Kiev. However, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called for calm, saying right now the people's biggest enemy is panic. Zelensky said that if Western powers had any firm evidence of an impending invasion, he had yet to see it. More than a dozen countries have urged their citizens to leave Ukraine. Russia's top foreign policy advisor, Yuri Yushkashov, has dismissed US warnings of an attack, saying hysteria has reached its peak. On Saturday, in a phone call, US President Joe Biden warned Russian leader Vladimir Putin of swift and severe costs if Russia sends in troops. UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, meanwhile, compared recent Western diplomatic efforts to stop an invasion to the appeasement of Nazi Germany. He said, quote, "There's a whiff of Munich in the air," a reference to the agreement with Hitler that failed to prevent World War II. The US decision to evacuate the most of its embassy staff in Kiev was followed by a similar move by Canada and Australia. All three nations have instead shifted operation to the western city of Lviv, near the Polish border, although the UK ambassador has said she will stay in the Ukraine capital with a core team. Police have cleared the remaining protesters blocking a key bridge between Canada and the United States after a week of disruption. Canada's trucker protests against COVID vaccine certification across the border have paralysed trade across the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario. A judge issued an order on Friday to break up the protest, but dozens of demonstrators remained in defiance. Police have now cleared the road, though the bridge remains closed. The British government will take a step back from people's lives to pursue a smaller state, the Prime Minister's new top aide has said. Steve Barclay said that while public health interventions and vast amounts spent in the pandemic were right decisions, it was time for a, quote, "a more enabling approach." Number 10 says Prime Minister Boris Johnson will focus on domestic policy on a tour of parts of the UK this week. It comes as he faces continued criticism and concern from some Conservative MPs about his leadership. The Cook Islands is bracing for its first coronavirus cases after a visitor to the country tested positive. In a video posted on Facebook, Prime Minister Mark Brown said it's likely the person was infectious while on the island and further likely that the virus is in our community, he said. They mean silent transmission amongst citizens. The Pacific archipelago has never had community transmission of cases. While one 10-year-old boy tested positive for the virus in December, authorities later said he was not infectious and likely had tested positive only because he had been exposed to the virus in the past. Prime Minister Brown said the infected traveller spent 8 days in the Cook Islands and then tested positive for the Omicron variant before returning to New Zealand last week. According to Cook Islands data, 99.6% of the population are aged 12 and over are double vaccinated. A further 70% of those eligible have had a booster shot. A mob has killed a man for allegedly burning pages of the Quran in central Pakistan, police say, in the latest case of blasphemy-related violence in the country. Police say they have arrested more than 80 people in connection with the killing on Saturday in the district of Kanawal in Punjab province. Reports say the man was in police custody before the crowd snatched him. Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan said the case would be dealt with the full severity of the law and asked for a report on police officers accused of failing their duty to save the man. Heavy snow has caused major disruption to the Winter Olympics schedule, with temperatures set to plummet below minus 22 degrees centigrade at the Beijing Games. Several ski slope style events had to be pushed back a day because of the conditions at the Genting Snow Park, but the women's free ski qualifications were postponed today because of heavy snow and poor visibility. Difficult conditions at the alpine skiing meant that 33 of the 87 men's giant slalom starters were unable to finish. And finally, authorities in New Zealand have been playing Barry Manilow's greatest hits in an attempt to dislodge protesters camped outside the Parliament building. Songs by the veteran US singer are being played on a 15-minute loop along with the Spanish dance tune, the Macarena. The demonstrators, angry at COVID-19 vaccine mandates, responded by playing songs such as Twisted Sisters, We're Not Gonna Take It. The protests, inspired by the large rallies against vaccine mandates in Canada, began on Tuesday when a convoy of vehicles drove to the Parliament in the capital city of Wellington. They adopted the name Convoy for Freedom and blocked the streets in the city. By Wednesday, their numbers had dwindled to the dozens, but they increased again at the weekend. Tactics used by the authorities to try and get rid of the protests involved turning on the water sprinklers on the lawn where they were camped on Friday. But protesters retaliated by digging trenches and building makeshift drain pipes to reroute the water. Today, it was Barry Manilow, and if that doesn't work, there is always James Blunt. And that's the latest news. You're up to date. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
Now, I like a convoy, me. I've led convoys thousands of miles. I led a red London bus all the way from Big Ben to Baghdad. An epic journey, an epic movie, voiced by Oscar-winning actress Julie Christie. You can find it on my Patreon page as well as elsewhere. And I took several convoys all the way to Gaza, which was not quite as long as the journey to Baghdad, but very much more difficult and troublesome. The art of the convoy is for it to be big and broad and colourful and in a good cause. I continue to believe that the Freedom Convoy in Canada, which is now being replicated, I see, around the world, is not just a good cause, but is being done extremely well. And most of the public thought so too, because actually they raised millions of pounds in donations to assist their Freedom Convoy. In an act of shame and theft, several now funding platforms, GoFundMe being first, but now followed by others, sometimes asking under orders from the government of Canada in particular, but not only, to take the truckers off the air, to stop them receiving the life's blood of publicity and the oxygen of funding to keep their campaign going. Many of those who describe themselves as on the left don't like these freedom convoys. They don't like the truckers, even though the truckers are, by definition, working class people, blue collar people, people who work for a living and whose ability to work for a living has been severely undermined by the policies of their government. Now, I'll always be on the side of the workers, whatever the official communists and socialists and even trade unions say. I don't think I'm alone in that, but I have been facing my own personal backlash about my stand on this. But the campaign by the truckers and the convoys has continued to grow. A cross-country convoy in the United States is already underway. There's one in Australia. In Windsor in Canada, a town I know well that I've spoken at several times, there's effectively an occupation going on in the town. So we thought we would have up first James Melville, who is an analyst, an independent freelance writer, takes a close interest in these matters. He's a Scotsman from Fife with a big following. How did that happen? James, welcome to the show.
Evening, George. How are you?
I'm well. Now, how did a man from Fife get the kind of following from around the globe that you have amassed?
That's a very, very good question. By just trying to give my own truths, it wasn't something I set out to achieve in the first place, but, you know, men from Fife are quite opinionated, and so I think some of my opinions resonate. But like yourself, when you put opinions out there, sometimes people agree with them, sometimes people don't, and you become a little bit Marmite. But that's the whole point of freedom of speech. People can decide whether to follow or not. So I've been doing Twitter for about 4 or 5 years, and it's just growing. I see my politics as left of centre, but not down any rabbit hole of a tribe. And in particular, things like lockdown and vaccine passports, and also the truckers and why they're doing it. I've been very, very supportive of the truckers because they see themselves from a working class point of view, losing their freedoms, losing their rights, losing their ability to gainfully work in the way that they see fit. So I'm all for the truckers, and I'm pleased that that movement is spreading worldwide.
Well answered. Now, let's start in Canada. What was particularly egregious about Justin Trudeau's government's stance that triggered this mass response from the truckers?
I think it's twofold, George. I think firstly, it's something that's been coming down the tracks a long time about loss of freedoms, the draconian measures around lockdowns, the vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, I think was fundamentally, though, the Trojan horse for all of this. Because when you get to a point where you take away someone's medical choice and medical autonomy, that is crossing the line in terms of tearing up liberalism. And Justin Trudeau and a few others around the world, in terms of what's going on in New Zealand and Australia and in France, the self-styled so-called progressives are actually behaving in the most authoritarian way. And I think we've also got an ideological discussion here as well about what the definition of the left is. I do not see the left being manifested in the shape and form of what's happening in these countries right now, in particular by the government. The left, for me, is about two things. Firstly, protecting those who need it most. And part of that protection, as the second point, is protecting people's freedom and their ability to spread their wings and flourish in society.
Now, I had an angry former trucker on the show last week. He called up, not happy with me, and a lot of his friends then bombarded me with complaints about my discussion with him. He argued that the only thing that Trudeau was requiring was proof of vaccination from people who were intending to cross the American border with their trucks. Is that true?
No, I don't think it is. Basically, in Canada, they've gone down the route of vaccine passports, although this week, interestingly enough, possibly because of the truckers' convoy, some of the provinces in Canada have now U-turned on vaccine passports, which again shows you the power of a people's protest. This is one of the biggest mobilizations of a people's movement in the last 30 years. Now, Trudeau scuttled off in the last over the last few days during this particular protest. He was claiming he was unwell with COVID, but what a true leader should have done, he should have actually had a dialogue with the truckers, understood what their concerns were, rather than smearing them, as he did, saying that they were bigots and racists and ill-informed and ignorant. Instead, what we're getting on this convoy in Ottawa is largely a peaceful protest where the truckers are giving food to the homeless. The public are actually giving jerry cans to the truckers because the police are stealing some of their fuel. And a lot of this isn't actually reported on mainstream media. It's reported largely on social media and forums like yourself, George. But this is a massive, massive people power protest, and it's not being reported on the channels it should be reported on. So therefore, it gives the impression with a lot of our media and our political leaders who are trying to clamp down on this, that they're turning a blind eye to people's movements. And this people's movement is fundamentally a good thing. It's about freedom. It's about people getting their rights back. It's about people having the opportunity to flourish, survive, and live in society without a heavy hand of government.
He even called them transphobes. I thought that took the biscuit myself. Truckers, transphobes, heaven forfend. And this from a Prime Minister who habitually blacked up his own face in an act of brazen cultural appropriation of black people. But you stumble on, or we have, you and I, stumbled on something on which we strongly agree, that it is undoubtedly the case that it is the so-called liberals, self-defined liberals, or leftists in some countries, who turn out to be the most authoritarian people of them all. Who'd have thunk it?
Therefore, it gives a suspicion of they're masquerading as something. What I want from our political leaders is authenticity. Now, if you look at, for instance, what's happening in the Labour Party, I know we're going in a different direction here, but for instance, with the Labour Party in the UK, Jeremy Corbyn, whether you agreed with him or not, had an authentic style to him. He did what he said on the tin. If you look at, for instance, Starmer, no one knows what he stands for. And if you look what's happening with Trudeau, what's happening in New Zealand and Australia, what's happening in France, you're getting individuals who, under sort of cloak and dagger, are pretending to be progressives. But actually, if you look what happened in Paris yesterday, for instance, where again there was a convoy and a protest about vaccine mandates and vaccine passports, and yet the police got involved with some heavy-handed tactics involving tear gas and batons.
Somebody was killed.
That is not the actions and the diktats of progressive governments. And I think we're in a different situation now, George, because I don't think the ideological battle is about left versus right anymore. I think there's a battle within the left about what the left actually means in terms of what is authentic left. But I think the debate is now moved on in terms of ideology. It is about authoritarianism versus a form of genuine liberalism. And there's a definition that has to be discussed about that as well. The old sort of dynamics of left versus right, based on what's happened over the last 2 years of COVID, I think the debate has now moved on from that. You're getting people from a bipartisan point of view who are forming alliances with people from previous issues on the other side. So, for instance, the whole phrase that politics makes strange bedfellows applies to myself. There's people I was on a different side to, for instance, as a Remainer on Brexit, who I'm completely on the same side with over the pandemic and the response to the pandemic. But that's a healthy thing. You've pointed this out before. Even Russell Brand has pointed out this before. We should be willing to work with people with different opinions on different issues to try and resolve a current issue. I think that bipartisan movement that's happening over COVID and the response to COVID, I think it's a healthy thing.
Well, as that great Marxist Groucho Marx said, when the facts change, so do my opinions. And the facts are clear that it is the so-called liberal, centrist, social democratic governments that are behaving worst on these issues of bodily autonomy, of medical choice, and so on. And that is providing, or producing rather, new alliances. But in fact, for quite a long time, James, what was left and what was right was beginning to come into question. And that's something you and I can perhaps discuss another day. Going back to Canada now, are you aware of what's happening in the town of Windsor in Canada? Because I have good memories of that place, and yet it's beginning to look like Paris with the heavy-handed actions of the security forces. In Canada, for God's sake.
Yeah, well, it's been happening in New Zealand and Australia. In Australia, in terms of the protests, this is another thing that has been sort of the mainstream media have been turning largely a blind eye to. The protests about vaccine passports in particular have been going on for months. In Australia, every weekend they've been going on. Peaceful protests. People have been lighting candles, doing vigils, singing songs, creating the optics of peaceful protests in numbers that are growing week by week. It's the same in Italy, it's the same in Germany, it's the same actually in London as well. And quite often those protests have been smeared by individuals in government and also in the media as anti-vax protests. There will be some anti-vaxxers on those protests, but the majority of people who are on those protests are doing those protests for a number of reasons. One, concerns about freedom. Secondly, about they see it as an unethical mandate through vaccine passports. And then you combine it with the point that you've just mentioned to tie that back in, the heavy, almost brute force sanctioned by progressive governments to get the police in with batons and tear gas, not just in Canada, but it was happening in Paris yesterday, and it's been happening in Australia on and off for months. And so therefore we have to have somehow an open conversation about what actually defines a progressive government if that is the measures undertaken by so-called self-styled progressive governments.
Stay on the line, if you will, James, because we've got a caller from Ontario, Ken, on the truckers. If that's technically possible, let's hear from Ken. Ken, go ahead. What would you like to say?
Hi, George.
Hi there.
I had the pleasure many years ago of being on the steering committee of the Canadian Peace Alliance, which brought you to Canada on a speaking tour.
I recall, yes, very well. Thank you.
And we were thrilled to have you here, and we loved what you had to say in solidarity with the Palestinian people and against the U.S. intermeddling in the affairs of the countries of the Middle East.
Yeah.
But we are somewhat dismayed by the fact that you see the so-called Freedom Convoy as a manifestation of workers in Canada, and it's exactly the opposite, George. Ken,
it is a manifestation, and they are workers. So
no, they aren't. George. I beg to differ.
All right,
with you.
go on, differ.
Okay, thank you, George. The Teamsters Union, which represents the unionized drivers in Canada, condemned the Freedom Convoy, and so did the Canadian Labour Congress, which represents almost all the unionized workers in Canada. And that's because these are people who are not unionized workers. They're not even wage workers. They are owner-operators and small trucking firm owners who employ other workers, usually immigrant workers, usually South Asian Sikh drivers, as their employees. And these workers, incidentally, are responsible for 80% of the labor standards complaints in Ontario for wage theft by these owner-operators. And that's who is in this convoy.
Well, there must be an awful lot of them, Ken, because the pictures I see is a vast number of drivers. Let me tell you, I stopped taking ideological guidance from the Teamsters around the time of Jimmy Hoffa. So don't pray them in aid to me. It seems to me that your problem with these workers is that you're not leading them, that they have decided to take action themselves. And if you're not leading them, they must be fascists.
No, they're, George, if I may again disagree, the people who are leading these owner-operators in the so-called Freedom Convoy are indeed fascist. And I'm referring specifically to Tamara Lich, who is one of the organizers, and she is a right-wing extremist person who belongs to a separatist party called the Maverick Party and the Wexit Party in Western Canada. And another leader is Pat King, who is an open white supremacist who speaks at all their rallies. They have a control room in a luxury hotel right now, as you and I are talking, in Ottawa, in which one of Trump's closest advisors is part of a discussion, part of the planning of these events, along with former and police officers, RCMP officers, and military intelligence officers. This has nothing to do with the working class.
Well, you've got a very funny definition of fascism, I must say. But let's hear from James Melville, and then I'll let you back in, Ken. Go ahead, James.
Yeah, I was just you're taking the words out of my mouth, George. The definition of fascism, effectively, it's like it's like almost the horseshoe theory. You could talk about sort of authoritarianism and fascism, but you end up sort of meeting somewhere down in the sort of murky waters at the bottom. For me, if you have a government that isn't allowing people medical choice, shutting down good businesses for months on end, stopping kids from education, shutting the schools, masking the kids, having issues of elderly isolation, causing mental health issues, crashes to the economy, and good businesses not allowed to basically function, restrictive trade, combined with trying to shut down largely peaceful protests, that is the horseshoe theory of authoritarianism, fascism. It's like basically two cheeks of the same backside.
They seek an alternative definition of fascism. One set of people are called fascists because they're small business owners, owner-drivers, and because they may have used the wrong pronouns or voted for the wrong party. And there's another definition of fascism which says a state mandating you to receive an injection against your will. Some would say that is a better definition of fascism. Ken?
George, we in the trade union movement think that Trudeau's and the provincial premier's response to the pandemic was pitiful and weak. They were unprepared. They had whittled down our healthcare systems to the bare bones, to the bottom of the OECD countries in terms of beds per thousand. And we think that they've had a miserable response. But the point of the protest isn't about the pandemic anymore. It was an attempt by noted and well-recognized right-wing fringe elements. This is their second.
Well, there must be an awful lot of them, Ken. You keep saying that. Ken, you've named 3 people. You've called them fascists. I've never heard of them, so I don't know if that's correct or not. I suspect that it isn't. But there's thousands and thousands of truckers here. Are they all fascists?
George, you failed to note that there have been counter-protests by ordinary working people, including union members, that have been organized. There's one going on right now in Ottawa as we speak. Yesterday,
but Ken, you're not answering my question,
No,
Ken.
I'm not saying that everybody in the protest is a fascist. There are a lot of disgruntled people who
Isn't there much to be disgruntled about in Canada and Trudeau? Wouldn't you be better throwing your lot in with other blue-collar people that reject the government of Trudeau, an imperialist stooge? Wouldn't that be a better approach for the so-called trade union movement to adopt?
Well, the trade union movement opposes the government of Trudeau.
You're backing him. No, you're backing him. You're backing him against the truckers.
Not at all. But these guys are not workers. They're not blue collar, and they are being funded from outside the country. Well, mainly 50%
these are all
of the
tropes.
funding came from the U.S.
Ken, these are all tropes. These are workers with blue collars who work for a living, who depend upon their work to live, and they are in action. Isn't action against Trudeau and the Canadian state something that you ought to consider whether you should join? Have you been able to move large numbers of Canadian workers against Trudeau, against the system there? I suspect that you have not. I've got another caller on the line. James, stay on the line. Anthony is in Detroit. Go ahead, Anthony.
Hey, George. I'm on the other side from the bridge from there in Windsor, Canada. And, yeah, they had it blocked over for about 8 days, I want to say.
Unbelievable. And that's unbelievable. I've been in Windsor, a peaceful, sleepy place. And the state have basically closed it.
Well, they did. The police moved in last night and today and kind of took them out, and there wasn't too too violent, even though it did look like a big show of force. But now the thing is, I don't think this kind of blockage would have been able to happen for 30 minutes here on our American side. And as a matter of fact, the big three automakers were getting so upset about this blockage that our governor in Michigan, the one who almost got kidnapped by the FBI, she offered to send over some heavy equipment, quote unquote, for the Canadians if they couldn't handle the job, like on day 2 of the blockage.
Wow.
So, yeah,
no,
just,
I mean,
it really
this is
bothered.
a movement. It's a movement of working class people. It may be incoherent. It may have some people who support it, some people on it who are either rough around the edges or worse than that. But if a large number of working class people get involved in action to break a policy which is wrong, being implemented by a government which is bad, shouldn't workers, trade unionists, leftists be getting behind it, getting involved in it?
Absolutely. I don't know where the left is on this. It's kind of sad. And, you know, they always say, oh, well, 90% of the truckers are vaccinated, so these people don't stand. I'm like, well, that doesn't matter. This is still, you know, the little working man against the big government and the big business. So even if 90% are vaccinated, that 10% still matters.
Well, I'm vaccinated.
Right.
This is not about vax. This is about the determination of states to instruct, impose, make mandatory on those who do not wish it to take a medicine. How can anyone support that and call themselves left-wing?
Oh, absolutely. That totally flies in the face of the same arguments that the left wing makes for abortion. But, you know, the sad thing is, you know, I'd rather take the Canadian healthcare system over our American system here any day. But this whole pandemic and the control that our government has exerted over us, I think it's really damaged the movement for, you know, universal healthcare in America. I think a lot of people are taking a second look and saying, oh, if I'm going to be forced to take a medication, I'm not sure if I want this kind of thing.
Yeah, that's a good point, actually, James, isn't it? Those who have been advocating, agitating for decades in America for a public health system might well now wonder that the public health system, does that give the doctor the right, indeed the duty, to inject you, force you to take medicine that you don't want?
Yeah, completely. Everyone should have the choice on this. It's like anything else. I mean, you know, it should be about individual, especially with medical procedures. You know, there's various reasons why people won't have the jab. Some people might be trusting their natural immunity. Some people might have medical conditions. Some people might just be literally anti-jab. But fundamentally, it should be about choice. There is a lot of evidence to suggest that the jab, for instance, is reducing serious cases. That's a good thing. But there's also a lot of evidence to suggest that the jab isn't having any impact in terms of transmission. So therefore, it should be for all age groups down to the individual to decide, not coercion from so-called progressive governments. Now, going back, just touching on a point as well about the left and the paradox of the left, we've had a crisis for 2 years where the real winners of this are big pharma, big corporates, media largely surviving through the avenues of advertising revenue streams from government. And a lot of the left seem to be supporting all of that rather than the areas they would traditionally support, and that's kids' welfare, elderly isolation, job losses, waiting lists that are going through the roof. And if you look at the UK's point of view, we've got over 6 million people waiting for non-COVID treatments. That's normally the domain of the left. And they're turning a blind eye to all of that.
Yeah, completely ignoring it.
Progressive governments who are effectively allowing big corporates like Big Pharma to get stinking rich and at the same time taking away people's individual choice, in particular medical autonomy.
Anthony, you alluded to it. Let me put it more sharply. It is the mantra of liberals and leftists that no state can proscribe the right of women to have abortions. Bodily autonomy is normally one of the slogans of the left. I don't myself share it. I'm against abortion, but the idea that people should be free to decide that they are going to have an abortion however late in the term, and there are many people who support it right up to the very last minute, but that the state should be able to force you to have an injection. These don't sit easily with each other, do they?
Absolutely don't. And the funny thing is, it's hard to even get one of these pro-mandate people to even debate, because you realize if you get to the logical conclusion of their viewpoint, they'd say, well, you're putting everyone else in danger by not taking the medicine. And that just contravenes that the medicine is, one, supposed to protect them, and two, that it's just, you're just existing in a space and breathing. Like, that doesn't make, being a potential viral vector is not a crime, basically.
Well, as James just said, the vaccination is effective on the basis of the evidence we have of stopping you getting the disease, the virus, seriously or even fatally. It manifestly does not stop you getting it, or Trudeau would not now be hiding from his own people with COVID, because he's already triple, quadruple vaxxed.
Trudeau, I think he's back in the wings looking for more advice from his pal Klaus Schwab. I think that's where he's taking his marching orders from.
Well, Anthony, thank you for that. James Melville, been a pleasure meeting you, albeit over the airwaves. Thanks very much for joining us on the mother of all talk shows. Will there be war over Ukraine? 3,400 votes. If that gets to 4,000, it's the biggest poll we've had, but still, around 3/4 of you or more think that there will be no war over Ukraine. Have I got a question? This was the week in 2003 when 11 million people worldwide took to the streets in protest. What were they protesting about? A, food prices. B, fuel shortages. C, the Iraq war. Answer after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Our world is full of mysteries. The lost city of Atlantis. Area 51. Who killed JFK? The clock on Dr. Ranjit Brah's wall.
It's a conspiracy, man. We have a right to know.
Shut it, you nutter! The senseless made sensible. Only on the mother of all talk shows.
Sputnik has been launched to give you a closer look at everything happening in the world. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The mother of all talk shows. Join our faculty of legends, contributors, and callers. Everyone is welcome.
And the answer, of course, is against the Iraq war. Now, about our groundbreaking podcast, Maxwell the Monster. If you're a Patreon supporter of mine, you've got the whole series right now when logging in via patreon.com/George Galloway. But at 10 o'clock tonight, I'm going to press a button which will release the audio version of the podcast to everyone, to all subscribers for free. For a reminder of what the series is about, take a look at this.
There is no trick other than hard work, creativity, care, and recognizing that duty is more important than love.
The booming voice of Robert Maxwell, an arrogant man who used his publishing empire to gain him power and influence. But in this shocking account, never told before in this way, George Galloway recalls his first encounter with Maxwell.
It looked like a grizzly bear advancing towards me and punches me with these giant fists, like sides of ham, right in the solar plexus. so hard that I literally bent double.
Then, after George exposed Maxwell as a crook in Parliament, it was war.
Every one of his papers, the Daily Mirror, then following the Sunday Mirror, the Sunday People, the Daily Record, then a few days later the Sunday Mail in Scotland, even the European, which he then owned, all over Galloway.
Scottish Daily News journalist Ron Mackay was there.
Every night, presumably when he had a drink in him, he would boom over the tannoy about the cretins, the fools. The majority of the workforce believed that he would take it over and their jobs would be secure. But of course he didn't. He just disappeared.
And then...
The millionaire newspaper publisher Robert Maxwell is dead.
What really happened? Did Robert Maxwell jump, or was he pushed?
It could be that he went out to, as he did, micturate over the side of the boat. I'm with Ghislaine Maxwell in that I lean towards the murder.
This is Maxwell, the monster.
You said, what is my secret? I will let you and your viewers know what it is. I'm not attached to property. Consequently, losing or gaining it means nothing to me.
I love that bit. Did he micturate or was he murdered? It's a three-part series. It delves into the troubled past of the monster, father of Ghislaine Maxwell, of course, who rocked the newspaper world in the 90s as his publishing empire collapsed. I could show you my scars. Our Patreon supporters have been loving it. Here's just some of the commentary. Excellent documentary, reasons why I very rarely buy newspapers. Fascinating to listen to the story. I remember reading all about this in the papers all that time ago. I had no idea what was really going on. Now, if you're a subscriber to our podcast, and remember, something like 130 countries now have people who are, then part one of this series will be released tonight at 10 o'clock when I push the button on my laptop at the end of the show. Part two will follow next week, with the final part going live at the end of the show in a fortnight's time. But if you can't wait until 10 p.m., or you love it and can't wait until next week's, please go to www.patreon.com/George Galloway. Become a supporter and watch it all and much more right now. I understand that episodes 1 to 100 of The Mother of All Talk Shows has already been put up on my Patreon page. My audio book about the 1970s, defending the decade of the 1970s, is also going up there, as well as exclusive footage of the meetings I did all over Britain in the run-up to the Iraq War. If you were at those meetings, you can see yourself on film. It's a fashion disaster, I can tell you. Let's take some more calls. Here's Paul in Ottawa on the truckers. We're big in Canada this evening. Paul, go ahead.
Can you hear me, George?
I can, yes. Go ahead, sir.
Awesome. So I just want to start this off with saying there's a big difference between peaceful protest and nonviolence. It's kind of hard to square giving the leader of a country the finger and saying that's very peaceful. So I'm all for nonviolent protest, and that's pretty much what's going on. That's what Gandhi did. That's what MLK did. And if you're not disrupting, if you're not being quite literally a pain in the butt, you're not doing it right.
You're not doing it right. That's the truth of it, yeah.
So I live downtown, and of course, I hear the horns, but like I'm not right in the center, and I do have friends that live in the center, and it's driving them crazy. And it probably would me too. My heart goes out to them. But honestly, when I hear those horns, I hear music. I hear finally where, people are coming together. And as far as the other gentleman that was saying, the big, I bet he's got one of Putin's buddies in that hotel room downtown. Of course, they're going to have some sort of headquarters, and of course, they're going to be dealing with political matters. This is a protest, and I'm glad that they have organized people. As far as being an open racist, they've been calling open racist to Jeremy Corbyn and come on. I don't.
Those of us who supported Brexit, we're all racists too. It's just a knee-jerk smear, which has been used so often now. To borrow a medical term, it has lost its efficacy. If everyone's a racist, well, nobody's a racist.
Exactly, and like I say, right out of the get-go, the smear campaign started happening with all the guys that are organizing it. Well, you need somebody at the top, and sometimes even that leader, it might not be. I might not like them. I don't need to like the politics of it all. I mean, you got together with Farage. I mean,
I did, and I'll tell you something else, Paul. I've been on 500 picket lines in my life. I'm not prepared to vouch for all the political views of everybody that was standing next to me on those picket lines. All that mattered to me at that moment was that they were on that picket line with me. They agreed with me on this thing, maybe only this thing. The idea that left-wing people, trade unionists, labour councils, the Teamsters, will not go near anyone who has a point of view different to theirs on 1 or 2 or 10 issues, when they could actually be uniting with people against Trudeau.
Well, I'll let you in on a little secret to use your own vernacular there. I was a union guy for steel, and I was, as we call a unit chair for, the shop employed up to 300 people. So it wasn't a small deal. I'm not saying that I was the greatest thing in sliced bread, but steel, I know because I still have contacts with the people that work there. They were all pro-mandate. They were completely against this, and which is their right. I mean, you can, but I know that the workers are totally against. Hey, if I don't want a vaccine, I shouldn't have to take one.
Well, once upon a time, that would have been the alpha and omega of people on the left. I don't know when the left morphed into a part of the political spectrum that was in favor of forced medication of people. That's quite extraordinary. Before I let you go, Paul, what's the atmosphere in Ottawa now? If you sound your horn, you're committing a crime. People donate you money, it's stolen by the fundraising platform. It's a crime to give food or petrol to the truckers. What's the morale like amongst the truckers?
Okay, so don't listen to the mainstream media, and the morale, they ain't going anywhere. And, somebody, now, he might have been, I don't know who he was, but he said they got enough for 4 years. So they are, and their resolve is strong, and that's what you need. Even if you don't agree with them, you have to admire the resolve of these people. And, they got live bands on stage, bouncy castles for kids. I mean, the morale is awesome. Everybody's walking around with big smiles. The only violence I ever saw was a cop pushing around somebody with a jerry can, and the guy ended up taking the jerry cans. I truly believe that most of the police really don't want to be involved. They have to do their marching orders. So you know what? If they bust somebody's chops, well, I tried. Yeah, I can vouch. We did our thing. It's a game right now, and you know what? The truckers are in the driver's seat, and that's where I want a trucker to be.
Amen to that. What a great line. Paul in Ottawa, thanks for that call. James in Collingwood disagrees with me. That's why his call has been.
Betcha I do.
That's why his call has been prioritized. Go ahead, James.
George, first of all, let me state my interest. I'm a big supporter of yours. I've listened. This is the 139th of these of these programs on Sunday afternoon.
Excellent.
And I've listened to almost every one. Maybe I missed one or two. And my other interest is I am an old surgeon. I practiced medicine and surgery for over 60 years. And I have two children older than you are, so that you can tell how old I am from that.
Okay.
First of all,
welcome, James. Go on.
Section 7 of our Constitution Act is against forced medication. We're not trying to force anybody to have medication. If they want to do their job, and they have to, and we have to cut down the inactivity of them, then they should be vaccinated. But if they don't want to be vaccinated, they can stay home on their farm or do their building or not cross the border. Now, secondly, I think your numbers are wrong. I do not think there are thousands and thousands. There were several hundred trucks in Windsor, and as far as the television tells me, that Windsor is now cleared, but they haven't opened the bridge yet. And in Ottawa, there are somewhere maybe between 1,000, but certainly less than 2,000 truckers, but there are not thousands and thousands. And the other point is they are so extreme, they want the Prime Minister to resign. The Prime Minister can't resign. The mob cannot force the change of the government of Canada. It can't do that.
I want your Prime Minister to resign. Does that make me a part of a mob?
No, you're not.
Do Prime Ministers never get brought down by mass upheaval in the countries they're misgoverning?
Well, yes, they do, and sometimes they get murdered by them, too. But that's not a good idea. But we just had an election. I didn't vote for Trudeau's candidate, but Trudeau was just elected, I think it was September last. And if you want to get your advice on handling an epidemic from truck drivers, then get it from truck drivers.
No, I took my doctor's advice and I got vaccinated twice.
So did I, and so are 90% of the truckers, they say.
Yeah, but you say that your Constitution forbids forced medicine, but at the same time you say that if you don't take the medicine, then you become a non-person. You can stay home on your farm. You can't drive a truck.
Yes, you can drive a truck. You just can't drive a truck over the Canada-United States border.
No, well, that's what someone said last week, but it turns out that's not true. This is all about vaccine passports. It's all about state mandating of medicine. Now, you are a surgeon. You would never accept one of your patients being forced, either literally forced or by force majeure, to accept treatment from you, Doc?
Well, now, all right, take it on my own treatment. The College of Physicians and Surgeons deals with surgeons this way. If you are doing something where you're liable to stick your finger, or stick a needle into your finger, and that's I did deep surgery in the abdomen. If you're in danger of that, you have to have repeated tests and to be sure that you're not a carrier of hepatitis, and we all accepted that, and I think a healthcare worker who is dealing with people should be vaccinated, and if I were in charge of it, I would only hire them when I was desperate because I couldn't get anybody else.
Well, you could make that argument for a healthcare worker, but you certainly can't make it for a guy that delivers petrol to the local petrol stations with his truck.
I don't think that is the law here. I haven't heard that at all, and I'm retired now, so all I do is watch the television and try and make sense of some of the things that go on.
You might not get the best sense on the television, James. Been a pleasure disagreeing with you. Let's go to Cincinnati and talk to Gary on the same subject. Go ahead, Gary.
Oh, hello, George.
Hi.
I think the truckers' convoy is completely phony.
Oh, yeah?
I saw the Confederate battle flag and the Nazi swastika flag, both being flown by some people.
I didn't see that. I didn't see either.
I did.
Put up on social media now your picture of the truckers flying the swastika, will you? Are you on social media, Gary?
I was on CBC National, I believe.
No, Gary, before we go further, Gary, you've made a very, very serious allegation that people on the convoy are flying swastikas. I'd really like to see the evidence for that. Can you send it to me?
I don't have to look through the CBC National.
Is that the same CBC that said the Russians were behind the convoy?
No. No, well, as I said, and they were accused of peeing on the war memorial. And there's Tucker Carlson. He gave a spiel about supporting the truckers.
That doesn't make it wrong. He's also given a spiel against the war in Ukraine.
Well, okay, that's good.
Yeah.
But
so do we only agree with Tucker Carlson's right to say things we agree with?
What? No, but Tucker Carlson doesn't support the strike by the concrete workers in Seattle.
But he's supporting the truckers' strike, and he's opposing the war in Ukraine. You see where I'm going with this, Gary? You are seeking to anathematize anybody who disagrees with you on any one issue. And in the service of that anathematization, you are inventing the flying of swastikas. But you're not able to show me or the rest of the audience any evidence to support that. And to me, that's exactly what's been happening across the board on this issue. Last word to you, Gary.
Okay, but I did see him, and I'll look for the information.
All right.
If I find it, I'll send it to you.
All right.
But it was probably an episode of CBC The National in the last week.
Okay, go on. Is that it?
Yeah, that's it.
Okay, Gary, thanks for the call. As I say, I've got so much social media. I don't know if I'm going to get through with it. No time for another caller before the news. Aaron Daly says, I'm far from a Trumper, but if Trump was in, he would negotiate and discuss the issues with Putin. Hans Mulkins says, Ukraine, the borderlands between Russia and civilized Europe, is on fire. For centuries, it's been at the center of a tug of war between powers seeking to control its rich lands and Russia's access to the Mediterranean. I really dig that, civilized Europe, don't you? As Mr. Gandhi said when asked by an American journalist what he thought of Western civilization, he replied, yes, that would be a good idea. Now, the poll numbers didn't quite reach record, but pretty high. 3,800 of you voted. Will there be war over Ukraine? Roughly speaking, 3/4 of you think there will not. So it seems that I am in a minority, which sometimes happens. It's not always the fact that if you're in a minority, you're wrong. And I very much hope that I'm wrong on this. We've got a new poll now. Is Boris Johnson right that COVID is over? A, yes, B, no. Well, it kind of depends what you mean by over. I don't write the polls, by the way. But that's the poll. Is Boris Johnson right that COVID is over? A, yes, B, no. Coming up after the news, we've got the coolest of American commentators, Garland Nixon, and we've got the wonderful Shadia Edwards-Dashti, our very own homegrown RT colleague of mine, on the political situation here in Britain. It's not nearly as exciting as it is in Canada, or even in North America as a whole, it would appear. That and your calls from legends and non-legends. If your point of view disagrees with mine, your call will be prioritized. And if you are a woman caller, your phone call will also be prioritised. 08 081 96 55 22 if you're in the UK, and +1 844 944 3344 if you're in North America.
Radio Sputnik News.
The president of Ukraine has urged calm, saying that the biggest enemy was panic, as the US Secretary of State Antony Blinken said the imminent threat of Russian military action in Ukraine justifies evacuating the US embassy in Kiev. However, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky called for calm, saying right now the people's biggest enemy is panic. Zelensky said that if Western powers had any firm evidence of an impending invasion, he had yet to see it. More than a dozen countries have urged their citizens to leave Ukraine. Russia's top foreign policy advisor, Yuri Yushkashov, has dismissed US warnings of an attack, saying hysteria has reached its peak. On Saturday, in a phone call, US President Joe Biden warned Russian leader Vladimir Putin of swift and severe costs if Russia sends in troops. UK Defence Secretary Ben Wallace, meanwhile, compared recent Western diplomatic efforts to stop an invasion to the appeasement of Nazi Germany. He said, quote, "There's a whiff of Munich in the air," a reference to the agreement with Hitler that failed to prevent World War II. The US decision to evacuate the most of its embassy staff in Kiev was followed by a similar move by Canada and Australia. All three nations have instead shifted operations to the western city of Lviv, near the Polish border, although the UK ambassador has said she will stay in the Ukraine capital with a core team. Police have cleared the remaining protesters blocking a key bridge between Canada and the United States after a week of disruption. Canada's trucker protests against COVID vaccine certification across the border have paralysed trade across the Ambassador Bridge in Windsor, Ontario. A judge issued an order on Friday to break up the protest, but dozens of demonstrators remained in defiance. Police have now cleared the road, though the bridge remains closed. The British government will take a step back from people's lives to pursue a smaller state, the Prime Minister's new top aide has said. Steve Barclay said that while public health interventions and vast amounts spent in the pandemic were right decisions, it was time for a, quote, a more enabling approach. Number 10 says Prime Minister Boris Johnson will focus on domestic policy on a tour of parts of the UK this week. It comes as he faces continued criticism and concern from some Conservative MPs about his leadership. The Cook Islands is bracing for its first coronavirus cases after a visitor to the country tested positive. In a video posted on Facebook, Prime Minister Mark Brown said it's likely the person was infectious while on the island, and further likely that the virus is in our community, he said. They mean silent transmission amongst citizens. The Pacific archipelago has never had community transmission of cases. While one 10-year-old boy tested positive for the virus in December, authorities later said he was not infectious and likely had tested positive only because he had been exposed to the virus in the past. Prime Minister Brown said the infected traveller spent 8 days in the Cook Islands and then tested positive for the Omicron variant before returning to New Zealand last week. According to Cook Islands data, 99.6% of the population are aged 12 and over, are double vaccinated. A further 70% of those eligible have had a booster shot. A mob has killed a man for allegedly burning pages of the Quran in central Pakistan, police say, in the latest case of blasphemy-related violence in the country. Police say they have arrested more than 80 people in connection with the killing on Saturday in the district of Kanawal in Punjab province. Reports say the man was in police custody before the crowd snatched him. Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan said the case would be dealt with the full severity of the law and asked for a report on police officers accused of failing their duty to save the man. Heavy snow has caused major disruption to the Winter Olympics schedule, with temperatures set to plummet below minus 22 degrees centigrade at the Beijing Games. Several ski slope style events had to be pushed back a day because of the conditions at the Genting Snow Park, but the women's free ski qualifications were postponed today because of heavy snow and poor visibility. Difficult conditions at the alpine skiing meant that 33 of the 87 men's giant slalom starters were unable to finish. And finally, authorities in New Zealand have been playing Barry Manilow's greatest hits in an attempt to dislodge protesters camped outside the Parliament building. Songs by the veteran US singer are being played on a 15-minute loop along with the Spanish dance tune, the Macarena. The demonstrators, angry at COVID-19 vaccine mandates, responded by playing songs such as Twisted Sisters, We're Not Gonna Take It. The protests, inspired by the large rallies against vaccine mandates in Canada, began on Tuesday when a convoy of vehicles drove to the Parliament in the capital city of Wellington. They adopted the name Convoy for Freedom and blocked the streets in the city. By Wednesday, their numbers had dwindled to the dozens, but they increased again at the weekend. Tactics used by the authorities to try and get rid of the protests involved turning on the water sprinklers on the lawn where they were camped on Friday. But protesters retaliated by digging trenches and building makeshift drain pipes to reroute the water. Today, it was Barry Manilow, and if that doesn't work, there is always James Blunt. And that's the latest news. You're up to date. I'm Jamie Lowe.
You're listening to Radio Sputnik. Telling the untold.
Welcome to the Open University of the Airwaves with George Galloway. Only on Sputnik Radio.
I have never heard of a more vicious act of state violence than that which I've just heard of on the news. The Australian government is playing Barry Manilow's music on a loop, along with Do the Macarenas, in order to drive protesters off the street. This is cruel and unusual punishment. It is of a kind, forcible medication. I have never heard of a more atrocious thought crime than forcing me to listen to Mandy, oh Mandy, because it means something different to those of us here in this country of a certain age and a certain political line. Is Boris Johnson right that COVID is over? A, yes. B, no. Oh my goodness, that has gone off like a rocket, I must say. You must check out, by the way, the interview I did with Roger Waters and Randy Kerdico, who runs a wonderful podcast several days a week, I think, in America. He's really a terrific guy. I've known him for a long time now. But he brought together Roger Waters and me in a wide-ranging, and if I say so myself, pretty interesting, and at times profound, sometimes even moving discussion. Do please look out for that. The votes are rocketing upwards on this Is COVID Over? I'll give my own view on that in just a minute. But we're joined, he squeezed us in right before the Super Bowl, by the coolest of them all, Garland Nixon. The most popular of our American correspondents, I can tell you officially. Garland, thanks very much indeed for joining us. Before we go on to the serious business, who's going to win this Super Bowl? And what is it anyway?
Well, I'm going with the Cincinnati on this one. Let me put it like this: I'm rooting for Cincinnati simply because they've never won a Super Bowl, and Cincinnati really hasn't won any sports championships in probably 25, 30 years. So I'm going with the city that needs a little bit of uplifting.
Didn't Jerry Springer come from Cincinnati? He was the mayor of Cincinnati, I seem to recall.
Yes, in fact, he was. There are a lot of people rooting for Cincinnati. The thing about the Rams is it's a team that's moved around a lot, and Los Angeles has all of these transient teams that, they're there for a few years while the owners collect a couple $1 billion in a new stadium, and there are many suspecting that the Rams will be another team moving through Los Angeles on the way to the next owner's money grab.
Kroenke owns the Rams. He also owns Arsenal, an actual football team here. I'm sounding like I know what I'm talking about here, but I don't. You call it American football, but the last thing that happens is anyone putting their foot on the ball. How do you account for its popularity in the U.S.?
Well, the thing about it is, part of it is a uniquely American game, and it is, it started here in America. We have what's called Pop Warner leagues, where kids start playing at a very early age. And believe it or not, my best friend played college football, played in the National Football League, and he had a couple of kids, and he said, I'll let my sons play soccer. He said, because I got my brains bashed out and my knees broken up in football, and I prefer if my two sons play another sport.
That's a very good point. Maybe that's what's produced all these political leaders that we have suffered under from your country. But on to the serious business. Garland, this may be the last time we get to talk to each other, either because the world's about to come to an end, or we're both going to be taken down and off the air. It is a very serious moment, isn't it? We could be on the verge of, and your government says we are on the verge of, what will turn out to be a cataclysmic war in which many will die.
Yeah, and a big part of the discussion that started here, a brilliant economist named Michael Hudson wrote an article at thesaker.is in which he argued that this isn't about Russia or China, that basically what the U.S. empire is trying to do is trying to increase its stranglehold on the EU. When the U.S. initially said they wanted the European countries to join them in their crusade against China, a number of European countries said no. You see, European countries are acting independently. They're trying to increase trade with Russia and China. They're looking out for their own economic needs. And the U.S. wants to basically cut them off from trade. So in a way, in an abstract way, this isn't really about Russia as much as it is the U.S. empire increasing their stranglehold on the EU, and basically, hopefully, as far as the neocons would be concerned, to sacrifice and martyr Ukraine so that they can get more power over the EU. I personally don't think it's going to happen. But
they are actually asking Europe to sign a suicide note. America can live perfectly happily without Russia. And indeed without China. But Europe can live without neither. In the very short term, in this bitter winter, a war with Russia, ending all gas supplies from Russia, will bring Europe to a crashing halt. For any European power to sign up to that is the surest sign of vassalage, isn't it?
It is. It's pure suicide, and I think that there are a number of European countries that are figuring that out, not the least of which being Ukraine. One thing to keep an eye on in Ukraine, because the question is, if a war were to kick off, how would it start? Clearly, the Russians are not going to invade Ukraine out of the blue. However, if the Ukrainian military were to launch an offensive on the Donbass, on the Russian-speaking regions of eastern Ukraine, clearly Russia would be obliged to act to counterattack to protect them. I think basically what we've been seeing lately from Ukrainian leadership is that they realize the U.S. just wants to throw them to the dogs. The U.S. just wants to watch them get turned to rubble, and they can use that as an excuse then to separate the EU from Russia. And I think Vladimir Zelensky is, from what I've seen, he doesn't want to have that. Keep an eye on Petro Poroshenko. He's back in town. I understand that the U.S. and Canada have acted have acted frequently and powerfully to stop the Ukrainian government from arresting him, which was their original plan. So there could possibly be a move to replace Zelensky with Poroshenko if they can get him to agree. But even then, they've got to get a Ukrainian leader to agree to turn his own country to rubble and possibly cost his own life on behalf of the U.S. getting more power over the EU. That's a tall order to ask anyone.
As you describe it, it certainly is. I asked this of an earlier guest also, how is all this playing in Peoria? What are the American people aware that we're on the brink of something potentially as volcanic, as earth-changing as this?
Yes, well, they can't help but be for this reason. The U.S. media is, night and day reporting that, the Russians are going to invade Ukraine yesterday, basically. That's the only thing they haven't said is they're going to invade them yesterday. But there's a constant barrage of that. The danger there is, for the U.S. Media, is that this has been going on for several months, and now it's hit a fevered pitch. If, as I suspect, the Russians do not cooperate and the Ukrainians are not as suicidal as the neocons would hope, they're going to run into a brick wall at some point where they're going to have to stop saying it. And what little respect that the U.S. media has will melt away even more.
The Grand Old Duke of York famously marched 10,000 men up to the top of the hill and marched them down again. And there may be, if you're right, something of this. Let me move on, if I may. I've been having quite a fierce discussion on the show this evening about these truckers, the truckers' convoys. We've got the traditional left people that tell me they organize speaking tours for me in Canada and so on, who use words like Teamsters, use words like Canadian Labour Council and so on, describing people who are manifestly workers in that they work for a living driving a truck. I don't know how much more of a worker you can be when you drive a truck for a living. Even if you're the owner-driver, you're a worker, unless you have some kind of weird definition of what a worker is. Denouncing people, taking direct action against a rotten government as fascists. Is this happening also in the U.S.?
I think this discussion is happening in the U.S. I'm 100% with you, and that is I'm not about who's doing it or what their particular ideology is. I'm about, what they're doing and the importance of what they're doing. I think it's important that this is an important discussion right now. If we look at the origins of the terms left and right, where did they come from? In the 1800s, in the French Parliament, those who literally, it was a literal metaphor. Those who sat on the right in the French Parliament were those who supported the monarchy and the establishment. Those who sat on the left tended to support the poor, the commoners, etc. So if you look at this movement, if we were to judge it by the initial standards, the original standards of left and right, one could argue they're working class people and they're fighting against the establishment policies. That would make this a left-wing movement. Now, I wouldn't want to go yelling that around because it might freak out some of the people that are in it that may not, see that the same way. But that's my view of it is whether we call it left or right, it is an anti-establishment. It is against I guess literally you could argue in Canada it is opposing the monarchy. So it's a traditionally left, it's a workers' movement. I think we need more of this. One other thing I think you should look at, we had a huge Kellogg's strike here. And it was 70% of the workers were doing great. There were 30% new workers who were going to get whose benefits weren't going to be as well. So the 70% joined the 30% to strike on behalf of the whole. I've heard anywhere from 80 to 85% of the truckers are vaccinated. That means that the majority are joining the minority on behalf of the whole. To me, that's traditional trade union worker type activity. And I think those on the left who don't supporting it are missing a tremendous opportunity.
I feel that, absolutely. But we've definitely put the cat amongst the pigeons. There's even more calls coming through now. I've no idea whether these people support the truckers or not. But it does, as you say, raise a bigger question of what's left, what's right. There are many people here who regard themselves as on the left that support the European Union. There are many people here who call themselves on the left that support NATO. There are many people here that call themselves on the left that support forced vaccination of people, forced medication, although they have a different take when it comes to issues like abortion. There are moments when you feel that you're living in or through a watershed. Is it left to support Joe Biden? I say no. Is it left to support the US Democrats? I say no. I would rather, at this moment, in acute international crisis, I'd rather that Trump was in the White House than Biden, because I believe that Trump, with the fascination for the deal that he has, he'd probably be there right now trying to make a deal. And so what's left and what's right in that picture? Over to you, Garland.
Well, here's something that I think is important. You know, traditionally, when we say fascism, such as in the literal Nazis in Ukraine, we're talking about ultranationalism. Well, when I look at the Biden administration and the authoritarian actions that they're taking, one could argue that it's a form of ultraliberalism that goes so far overboard that it becomes a form of fascism. You know, true fascism is neither left nor right. True fascism can borrow from the left, it can borrow from the right, whatever rhetoric needs to be used, because true fascism is about being able to have power and enact whichever policies you would like to enact. So I would argue that the terms left and right now in America, not only do they not apply, you have to be careful because they are being used by people to mislead a lot of our citizens to oppose policies that are in their best interest.
Garland, thanks for joining us. Enjoy the game tonight. I won't be joining you in watching it because it just looks like a game of rugby spoiled to me. But thanks for joining us. In 1959, Trudeau's father, Fidel Castro, became the 16th Prime Minister of Cuba, succeeding Fulgencio Batista. What happened to Batista? A, he fled. B, he was executed. C, he retired. Well, I've seen The Godfather, so I know the answer to that. Back after the break.
Radio Sputnik.
Time, weather, and...
Now, don't forget, you can download the podcast of this program, a finely edited highlights version of this 3-hour epic. It's being listened to now all around the world. Huge numbers are downloading the, as it were, compact version of the show. Of course, in the UK and the US, but listen to these countries that downloaded it last week: Japan, India, Denmark, Saudi Arabia, Korea, Switzerland, UAE, and Hong Kong in China. All of those had significant audiences of last week's show. Search Moats, M-O-A-T-S, on the app where you get your podcast from.
Tough questions are the most powerful weapon we have. As long as you have questions, we'll keep asking. Radio Sputnik, telling the untold.
The answer, of course, is that he fled. Batista fled in the closing moments of Godfather 2. Now, the poll is going big guns. Is Boris Johnson right that COVID is over? Yes, 72%. No, 28%. Though on YouTube, that's slightly different. Yes, 55%. No, 45%. And on Telegram, yes, 64%. No, 36%. So John in Detroit disagrees with me, so his call has been prioritized. Go ahead, sir.
Well, George,
nice talking to you.
And you?
I've been listening to you for a while, and I really do appreciate what you do in educating people.
Thank you.
I don't totally disagree with you, but I do want to put things in context. And I think what happens a lot of times is when we start looking at these individual incidents, without keeping them in context, we sometimes draw the wrong conclusions. So I want to say in the first place that I'm not against any workers. In fact, I'm not even against managers. What I am against is a system. And I look at all of these incidents as symptoms of a disease system. Mm-hmm. And I don't know if you're familiar with a guy named Richard Wolff, but Garland had mentioned...
Very much so. I'm a big admirer of his.
Okay. And so I basically am coming from where he stands. See, I don't like to blame people when I know the system is the issue. Mm-hmm. So I like to take every opportunity where I see a symptom of capitalism to educate people, to get them on board with one another.
That's usually done through action, John.
Sorry?
That's usually done through action. It's done on the picket line. You get close to someone on a picket line, they may have different politics to you, but they're on the same picket line. And you hope, if your ideas are better than theirs, that you'll influence them more than they'll influence you. That's the traditional way we did things.
Well, the picket line is fine, but anywhere you can influence anyone, you should take advantage of it.
Sure.
I've got a circle of friends. I've got a circle of acquaintances. I've got relatives. And so we start at home at a very point, and we work our way out from there. It's like a circle that expands.
Yeah.
And so every opportunity you take and you educate. Now, if you put things in context and you explain that the problem is not people, we don't want to blame people. We need to look at a system that's designed and it's characteristically operates in a way that creates all of these symptoms. So today, the symptom is these truckers having problems supporting themselves, making a living. I may not agree with everything about them, but I support them, and I'm not going to criticize them because I don't know enough about their particular situation. But what I would do is take the opportunity to educate them and make them understand that your problem is not unique. It's different, and you should join in with the rest of us because this is actually a class war, and it's not just in the United States, it's global. I like to always say in the United States we have, one capitalist corrupted, oligarchy corrupted political party disguised as a two-party system. And the reason it is because it's designed in order to keep the status quo going, they have to divide us. They have to atomize us, as you say. So
Great call, brother. I need to press on, but thanks for it. Rashid is in Long Beach. Go ahead, Rashid.
Your last caller was great. Spot on, sir.
First class, yeah.
I would just add to a little background. Back in 2011, 2012, the Nobel Peace Prize winner with his Assistant Secretary of State, Victoria Nuland, took $5 billion U.S. taxpayer dollars to overthrow the legitimately elected government in Ukraine.
Yeah.
And they went ahead and installed their favorite neo-Nazis, quite happily letting those people kill people in broad daylight and burn down buildings with people inside and think there's nothing of that.
And Biden's own family profited mightily thereafter.
Nothing changes. And thereafter, as soon as Mr. Trump had his surprise election win and he made overtures to Mr. Putin, the entire Washington establishment was up in arms. There's no way this Putin agent was allowed to make peace with the former Soviet Union and now Russia. It was just not going to happen. Well, they very successfully got rid of him. And as soon as Mr. Biden came in, they reenacted or restarted their Ukrainian madness. The whole point is this deep state is ready to, trigger World War III down to the last European, down to the last Ukrainian for their own crazy global adventures, their own idea or geopolitical point of view. But
brilliantly, again, Rashid, brilliantly expressed. They're ready to fight to the last drop of Ukrainian blood. When I saw that actually yesterday the US and the UK had withdrawn their soldiers from Ukraine, a country they claim is about to be invaded by Russia, I realized just how unbelievably cynical this whole thing is. Rashid, thanks for the call. I'm pressing on because of the hour. Ian in London, in Hounslow, on the truckers issue. Go ahead, Ian.
Hi, George. I was very intrigued by that call from Canada. I think it was Gary claiming there were Nazi flags at the truckers demo. I smelt a rat immediately, because there's reports of it. So I've checked it out. It turns out that there's 8,000, right? 8,000 truckers. One trucker had a Confederate flag with a truck on it. Right?
You see, that's not a Nazi flag. It might be a flag that is rightly reviled by those who hated the stand for slavery that the Confederacy made in the 19th century. It is not a Nazi flag.
But it's one flag. And at an adjacent building, hanging out of a window, there was an anti-Trudeau banner and a National Socialist banner. You know, the red flag with the swastika on it?
Yeah.
There's nothing to do with the demonstration.
Nothing to do with the truckers, no.
No.
Somebody just sent me similar of people standing by the roadside holding a Confederate flag, and in one case holding a swastika. But that's not the truckers. I want to see an image of a truck with a swastika on it. Or I don't want to hear any such false accusations made.
They're a group called Rise Canada. They call themselves fascists, but they're basically off Ward 5 to Rampton. That's where they're from. They're not even serious.
Okay, Ian, I appreciate you setting the facts right there. It's very important that you do so. I need to turn now to British political matters with our own correspondent, the wonderful Shadia Edwards-Dashti. Shadia, thanks very much indeed for the call. I wanted to ask you something up front, partly because you're a woman, but also because you're an acute observer of these things. Was Liz Truss seeking to mimic Margaret Thatcher on her brief and ill-starred visit to Moscow?
Oh, she was definitely giving her best Margaret impression. Certainly, it did feel like that, didn't it?
Yeah.
Also, interestingly, looking into that in slightly more detail, she appears a lot on the government's official photographs page. So I think she's got a bit of a penchant for a camera, really, and she's definitely doing a bit of posing in her best Thatcherite position there, definitely.
And Boris should be a bit anxious about that, shouldn't he? Because it seems to me she's limbering up for a leadership challenge.
Yeah, it certainly seems like she's gearing up for that, going off to Moscow, trying to do her best diplomatic mission. She's trying to put herself in the forefront of politics, left, right and centre. Every single day she's in the media now, and it certainly feels like when a leadership contest happens, I think she'll be one of those that puts her names right into the hat.
Now, not many people could stand up to Sergei Lavrov, the veteran foreign minister of Russia. He's been at the top for 33 years, and Liz Truss has been in her job for 5 months. But she clearly didn't even look at an atlas on the aeroplane journey. Indeed, she's been on quite a few, some of them very long aeroplane journeys. She hasn't been studying much about Russia and Ukraine before, as I say, the ill-starred encounter with Mr. Lavrov.
Oh, it was absolute disaster, to be honest. She said she was going there to try and diffuse, have some sort of tactic of diplomacy, and from the very get-go accused Russia of aggression and said that Russia needs to prove it's not an aggressive state in this circumstance. I mean, talk about guilty until proven innocent. It should be the complete reverse. She absolutely did a disastrous job over there. And talking of her tactics, she went out there saying that Russia needs to stop these war of words, stop the war rhetoric, and she went out straight away with a war rhetoric herself.
Now, you issued the magic words there, stop the war. They've been in the news. Also, the Labour leader, Keir Starmer, accused those of us who want to stop the wars of effectively being enemy agents.
I mean, just from the very get-go, Keir Starmer is supposed to be the leader of the opposition. It seems that the only thing he's opposing is the left. And an attack on Stop the War Coalition was really quite shocking in some ways, not so shocking in others. I wasn't particularly surprised that he's attacking the left, even though he's supposed to be somewhat representing them. But an attack on Stop the War Coalition is really, really significant at this point when a war could be imminent. He's supposed to be trying to do everything to diffuse all of that, and going against an organization that is absolutely at the forefront of peace in the United Kingdom, organizing about peace. And the only crime Stop the War Coalition is guilty of is trying to present a different narrative to the mainstream media. Instead of ratcheting up this war rhetoric, it's trying to look from a different lens, trying to give a bigger picture, slightly more truthful picture, and trying to engage in critical thinking. And that's something that Keir Starmer's not doing at all. He says that he's an anti-war activist himself. This is completely the opposite. To go against the Stop the War Coalition is absolutely detestable.
Yeah, now, speaking of absolutely detestable, Boris Johnson is also deep in trouble, isn't he? He has been sent documents by the police. It's called a questionnaire, but it's basically asking him to fess up and plead guilty to breaches of the lockdown rules, which are not serious crimes, but they are politically damaging, no doubt, and will be inflated in the media as politically damaging. They'll probably involve a £100 fine. Do you think that if that is the outcome of the police action, that it will trigger a leadership challenge against Boris Johnson?
Well, first and foremost, a questionnaire. It doesn't take a legal expert to know that that's not exactly the right way to go about things in terms of the process, the legality process. I've never heard of somebody that is thought to have committed a crime be handed a questionnaire. If that was the process, we'd have so many more criminals walking on the streets. I mean, that's arguably contestable in itself. But still, this is a bizarre way to look at it. Now, if Boris Johnson is fined, if he is found guilty, you would think that it would be the time to walk the plank. But I would argue that that time has long come already. He should be out. He should have been out a long time ago, not just for these Partygate scandals. They are bad enough, but so much more. If we even look a few years back, proroguing Parliament, this sort of thing, he always finds himself above the law some way, shape or form. And Boris Johnson is now trying to sweep even more things under the carpet. I mean, he pretty much needs a cleaner to do all of this sweeping for him, or at least he needs to buy a bigger carpet.
Who would your money be on? Prime Minister Truss or Prime Minister Sunak or somebody we haven't heard of yet?
It's a difficult one. I think Priti Patel seems to be... I feel like she's got her eyes on that prize. She's not really been too much in the news as of late. She's always finding herself into controversy after controversy, but we do know that she's after it. Rishi Sunak, I don't know if he's got the guts for that, to be honest, but whoever it is, it's dark days to come.
Well, let's see what happens. Thanks very much for that, Shadia. Much appreciated. Is Boris Johnson right that COVID is over? A, yes. B, no. You can vote until more or less the end of the show. Have I got another question? Yes, I do. In 2017, a new underwater continent twice the size of India was discovered in the South Pacific. Wow, I didn't know that. In 2017, a new underwater continent twice the size of India was discovered in the South Pacific. What was it named? A, Atlantis, B, Arcadia, C, Zealandia. Wow, that's news for me. Answer, after the break.
There is no trick other than hard work, creativity, care, and recognizing that duty is more important than love.
The booming voice of Robert Maxwell, an arrogant man who used his publishing empire to gain him power and influence. But in this shocking account, never told before in this way, George Galloway recalls his first encounter with Maxwell.
It looked like a grizzly bear advancing towards me and punches me with these giant fists, like sides of ham, right in the solar plexus, so hard that I literally bent double.
Then, after George exposed Maxwell as a crook in Parliament, it was war.
Every one of his papers, the Daily Mirror, then following the Sunday Mirror, the Sunday People, the Daily Record, then a few days later the Sunday Mail in Scotland, even the European, which he then owned, all over Galloway.
Scottish Daily News journalist Ron Mackay was there.
Every night, presumably when he had a drink in him, he would boom over the tannoy about the cretins, the fools. The majority of the workforce believed that he would take it over and their jobs would be secure. But of course he didn't. He just disappeared.
And then...
The millionaire newspaper publisher Robert Maxwell is dead.
What really happened? Did Robert Maxwell jump, or was he pushed?
It could be that he went out to, as he did, micturate over the side of the boat. I'm with Ghislaine Maxwell in that I lean towards the murder.
This is Maxwell, the monster.
You said, what is my secret? I will let you and your viewers know what it is. I'm not attached to property. Consequently, losing or gaining it means nothing to me.
George Galloway and the mother of all talk shows. Join us at the College of Knowledge, where there are no tuition fees.
Was he micturating or was he murdered? And is Boris Johnson right that COVID is over? Get your votes in. The answer to my question is Zealandia. Yeah, there was a new underwater continent twice the size of India discovered in the South Pacific only 5 years ago, and I am completely unknowing of it. In fact, I just accused the editor of having set me up in a practical joke. I really do think that you probably want to see the Maxwell, the monster. If you want to see it in video form, of course, go to patreon.com/George Galloway. You can see the full series there now, all 3 parts. But at 10 p.m. tonight, for everyone else who is subscribing to our podcast, I'm pressing the button on the audio. So stay tuned for that. I don't know if they're going to bring me in a button. There's a real button, apparently. Let's take a call. Paul in Salford on Partygate. Go ahead, Paul.
Good evening, George. I'll make this short and sweet.
Okay.
It's going to be a cover-up there. It's going to be a cover-up. And I think at the end of the day, well, let's face it, he's a liar. Anybody who
He's always been a liar, though, Paul. He got elected with people knowing him he was a liar.
Oh, yeah. You mean...
He's not the only... Boris is not the only liar in politics, and he's not the only liar in power.
No, there's about 600 of them in Parliament. the only one who wasn't a liar was you.
Yeah.
Everything you said came true. Can I quickly move on to a potential war?
Yes.
In the Ukraine?
Yes, of course.
Well, you're the same age as me. We go back to the 60s when you got the 3 or 4 minute warning when they advised you to put a wet mattress up against your window in the course of a nuclear attack.
Exactly.
But now nuclear weapons have become a lot faster, so it's probably 1 minute warning.
There's the blink of an eye, as Putin put it the other day.
Yeah, but this name will mean something to you. Barry Maguire.
I wish I could play it right now. You know that, Paul? I wish I could play Barry Maguire, Eve of Destruction. I encourage everyone to go and watch it.
Do you want me to play it for you? I've got it on YouTube.
No, I can't because it'll breach copyright and we'll get taken off the air. We just can't play music at all, which is very frustrating because Barry Maguire's rendition of Eve of Destruction is particularly apt this evening, I think, Paul.
Yes. Well, I've been reading about it. I mean, that was his one and only hit, I believe.
Yeah.
And, he's still with us. He's 87 now. He's 87. He's still alive and kicking. And he
should bring it out again.
Yeah, well, exactly. I was going to say that. You took the words right out of my mouth. But I mean, to all the warmongers out there in America and even on this side of the pond, I really believe that if there is going to be a kick-off, a massive war between Russia and I really hope there isn't going to be, but if it does kick off, number one, Mr. Putin, or Putin, if that's the right pronunciation, he's going to turn the gas off. So
sure, yeah, for sure.
He'll turn the gas off. And, you know, we can't afford the gas what we've got here anyway, so what's going to happen then?
Well, us in Britain would not be as drastically affected because only 5% of our gas comes from Russia. But in Germany, it's 50%. So the US are asking Germany to commit economic suicide.
But if the missiles start flying, then all the gas is gone anyway because we're all set on fire.
Exactly. We're all set on fire. What a very powerful line. Paul in Salford, thanks for that. Mike in South Carolina disagrees with me. His call too is prioritised. Go ahead, Mike.
Hey, George, how you doing? It's good to talk to you again.
And you, sir?
We don't disagree often, but I mean, you know, and it's not a great deal of disagreement. I absolutely, totally agree with people's rights to protest, and you know, this. But let's look at one thing, and just for an instance, now you would agree, I think, that the truckers up there that are doing this are a great many of them anti-vaxxers. Is that correct?
I don't know what their vaccination status is. Their protest is not against vaccination. It's against state mandating.
That's right. But they are. You would agree, I think, that a great number of them, not necessarily majority, but many of them are anti-vaxxers.
I can't agree because I don't know, and I don't know how you know. Okay. I don't know how you know.
Okay. Well, because the whole thing is about vaccinations. But let's go a step further here. A lot of the Trump base is anti-vax. A lot of them are. A great many of them. And if you look at this whole thing in a perspective, this is all about priority. It's not about vaccinations and the rest of it, because we've had mandatory vaccinations for quite some time. You had two earlier callers talking about the system that we're under, and the doctor, I think that doctor was from Canada, was he not?
He was.
The retired doctor?
He was.
Yes. Certainly about the Constitution, they're talking about this. Yeah. And I'm telling you that the Constitution of the United States, in the very beginning of it, says promote the general welfare of the people. Yeah. Now, that includes taking care of people in this COVID instance, which Trump did none of. In fact, if you listen to Bob Woodward's conversation with Trump, you understand that Trump knew from the very beginning this was a very, very serious pandemic, okay? And he did nothing about it. If you looked at other countries that did do something about it, their deaths and sicknesses were a lot less, like China, for instance. But, when you look at
Mike, if I trusted my rulers, then I would do what they told me to do.
Oh, I understand.
And if I was in China, I would trust my rulers. But if I'm in America or Canada or Britain, I don't trust them. Why are you asking me to trust them on medicine?
Okay, Okay, look at this, George. Right now, we are approaching 1 million deaths in the United States from COVID.
Yeah.
And you're asking in your question here, is COVID over? No, it is not over. Is it starting to decline again? Yes, it is. Are we still losing thousands a day? Yes, we are.
Well,
so
you're right.
COVID
It's a British-oriented question, and overwhelmingly people say yes, it is. But if it was a poll of people in the United States, it might give a different answer. Mike, thanks for the call. Del is in North London. Let's hear from him. Go ahead, Del.
Yeah, hi, George. Pure and simple. Let's make everything black and white. The deep state, we mentioned it before. And as you know, there is a deep state. So rather than fear-mongering that everything that's going on at the moment with the COVID, the wars, blah, 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 and I know you know because we talked about this before, why aren't we all addressing the deep state rather than this fear-mongering that's going over and over again?
How do you address it?
How do you address it?
Yeah. You said, why aren't we addressing the deep state? So the floor is yours. Yeah. Go ahead and address it.
Right, here we go, right? For example, your royal family have been exposed as paedophiles. The Prime Minister of this country has been exposed as a liar. All the countries around the world have been exposed for lying about the COVID. So isn't it about time someone stood up and just went, hang on a minute, there's something inherently wrong here?
Well, Prince Andrew is accused of having unlawful sexual relations with a 17-year-old. I don't think that qualifies as the royal family being paedophiles. And hold on, I'll let you back in. The Prime Minister being a liar, he's always been a liar. And in fact, I'm struggling to remember a Prime Minister that wasn't a liar. And I'm looking around the world and wondering if there are any rulers in the world that are not liars. I don't quite get your point. Are you saying that the building next door here and the one across the river from me here, MI5 and MI6, are you saying that they are trying to bring down the royal family and the Prime Minister?
What I'm trying to get across, and hopefully your listeners will understand this, there is a deep state at work, and you know that.
Everybody knows that. Everybody knows that. That's a statement of the bleeding obvious.
So let's do something about that, rather than rushing and rolling about the...
Give us a lead. Be our leader. Be our leader, Del. Tell us who are the deep state and what we should be doing about them.
I love it. Join the army. Because it won't be an army, will it? It'll just be like real people just going, hang on a minute, the world is wrong. Put your hands up. That's all we need.
No, Del, let me ask you again. Tell us who are the deep state and what we need to do about them.
Who are the deep states?
Yeah.
Oh, what a brilliant question. Those are all over us. And what should we do about them? We should make them accountable.
When you say they're all over us, what do you mean? I'm just trying to work out whether you're in the territory of shape-shifting lizards, or you're talking about MI5 and MI6.
Please don't turn it into a circus, George. Look, you're way up there, right? You know full well what's going on, and please don't.
I do. I'm just struggling to get from you what it is we should be doing about them. What should I do about MI5 and MI6, and how should I do it?
Just stand up and go, there's something inherently wrong here. And
there's something really wrong here. There's something really wrong here. There you are. I've sorted it, Del. Thanks for the call. Eve is in Idaho. Let's hear from him.
Hello, thank you for having me on your show.
Welcome.
First, I wanted to answer a question that you ask often. You say, who is in charge in United States for the foreign policy? And I think my best answer is William Burns, the head of the CIA. Okay, so that's the first thing. The second thing is that I think what happened with Ukraine is that Europe, EU, the EU, European Union, and NATO used to coincide, but with the departing of your country, it doesn't coincide anymore. And what happened now is that America has to put down the Europe like Germany and France, and I think their first goal is to shut down Nord Stream 2. And it can happen with some excuse with Ukraine or with something else, but I really believe that their primary goal for the short term.
Yeah, I'm sure that you're right, and it would appear that I saw it happen. The President of the United States, in the presence of the Prime Minister of Germany, said that Nord Stream 2 will not be allowed to operate. It was breathtaking in its audacity. I mean, he could have told them behind the scenes, but he told them in front of the cameras while the man was sitting next to him that a pipeline in his country will not be allowed to operate. But it's a very big price to pay for stopping a pipeline, isn't it?
Well, but you see, the NATO, what they see is that they are spending billions to encircle Russia with all those nuclear things and so on, and then they see a pipeline, coming through that and going to Germany, and that makes them very, very unhappy.
Yeah, you're right. There's a legend on the line, Eve, so I'll have to say goodnight to you and go over to Norma in Bristol on NATO. Go ahead, Norma.
Hello, George. Well, I actually think that NATO, it's called the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. It should be disbanded because, A, it's a warmongering organization, and when there is a Cold War situation, we had the Warsaw Pact. Now, that had been disbanded. And the campaign for nuclear disarmament, which has been wanting NATO to become obsolete for years, they worry that the aggression could escalate, and then what should we have? I mean, heaven help us, we don't want a nuclear war, do we?
No, indeed. Is the campaign for nuclear disarmament still going? I haven't seen any agitation from them around this.
Yeah,
I would have thought they'd have been right up the front on this.
They do actually. I get a letter and from a local one as well because I've been a member for years.
I mean, the leader refused to come on this show.
I know, it was awful.
In protest at some other matter that they disagreed with me on. What kind of campaign for nuclear disarmament is that? It's very, very strange. I'm genuinely interested to know if they still exist and if they're doing anything.
Yeah.
I haven't seen them on the streets.
No, because nobody ever puts on anything about it because they actually think we're crazy.
And there was
we're not.
There was I offering them a platform which they refused because they didn't like my views on Brexit. Almost unbelievable, but true. Now, Norma, we're old enough, both of us, to remember a time when millions of people in this country were so anxious about the prospect of nuclear war that they marched and protested and wore badges and so on. Why? Yeah, me too. Why is the public so quiet about what the Americans say is about to happen in the next 72 hours?
Well, I can't answer that, to be honest. All I know is that I brought that CND in because I'm still a member of it, and there's quite a lot of stuff I get on Twitter. But just very quickly, and I also think we should keep our nose out of Ukraine because we only complicate the situation. And, I mean, I must be simplistic, I know, but I just think both NATO and all this and what's going on in Ukraine, we should just keep our noses out because we just complicate the situation.
Norma, wisdom from Norma in Bristol. That's why she is a legend. Now, it's almost the end of the show, so I'm going to press this red button. You can count on me not to blow up the world with this red button. I'm not sure you can count on Joe Biden to do the same. Live! Podcast go live!